There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a family dinner table right after someone asks you for money. It isn't really silence. Forks still scrape, ice still clinks in glasses, someone's chair still creaks. But underneath all of that noise, there is a stillness, a held breath, a room full of people waiting to see if you will say yes. I said yes so many times in my life that saying no, when I finally did, felt like the loudest thing I had ever done. My name is Claire Whitfield. I was 43 years old when my younger sister Denise asked me to co-sign a car loan for her, and 46 when I packed 2 suitcases into the back of a rented sedan at 5 in the morning and drove out of Ohio without telling anyone where I was going. This is the story of what happened in between, and what happened after, which, if I'm honest, is the part I'm proudest of. I want to tell it slowly, the way it actually happened, because the thing about being used by your own family is that it never happens all at once. Nobody hands you a knife and asks you to hurt yourself. They ask for small things first. A ride to the airport, $100 until payday, a little patience. And by the time you understand what's actually been taken from you, you've already handed over so much that walking away feels like the unreasonable thing to do, not the years of quiet extraction that came before it. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the older of 2 daughters born to Harold and Marilyn Whitfield. My father drove a delivery route for a regional beverage company for 31 years. My mother worked the front desk at a pediatric dental office until her knees gave out, and she switched to answering phones for the same practice from a chair in the back room. We were not poor, exactly, but we were the kind of family where a broken water heater was a crisis discussed for a week before it was solved. Denise was born when I was 4, and from the moment she arrived, something in our house rearranged itself around her like furniture around a fireplace. She was, and I say this without bitterness, a beautiful baby, and then a beautiful child, and then a beautiful teenager who never had to try particularly hard at anything because people had spent her whole life deciding in advance that she was worth the effort. I don't say this to make myself sound like the plain, overlooked sister in a fairy tale, some Cinderella scrubbing floors while her siblings swanned off to the ball. It wasn't that dramatic. I got good grades. I had friends. I was, by most external measures, the successful one. I finished my accounting degree at Wright State while working 2 jobs, passed my CPA exam on the first try, and by 28, I had a solid position at a mid-sized firm in Dayton, handling tax and audit work for small manufacturing companies. I bought a modest 3-bedroom house in Kettering when I was 31. I was, in the language my mother used at every extended family gathering for the next decade, so responsible that Claire. But responsible in my family was never quite a compliment. It was a job description. It was the label that got affixed to me the way creative got affixed to Denise. And once you're labeled the responsible one, you stop being asked what you need, and you start being asked what you can give. Denise, meanwhile, drifted. She started a degree in graphic design and didn't finish it. She waitressed. She did some freelance social media work for a boutique that closed within a year. She dated a string of men our mother described as not quite right for her, right up until each one left. She was 31 and living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Beaver Creek with a leased car she couldn't really afford when she called me on a Tuesday night in March, 4 years ago now, and asked me the question that started everything. "Claire," she said, and I remember she used my full name, which she almost never did, which should have told me this was going to be a conversation with a capital C. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you say no." "Okay," I said, setting down the file I'd been reviewing at my kitchen table. "What's going on?" "My car got repossessed." I sat back in my chair. "What? When?" "2 days ago. I've been late a few times. And I know. Don't lecture me. but they took it right off the street outside my building. I have no way to get to work now, Claire. I clean houses 2 days a week and do the freelance stuff, and I need a car for both of those. I'm going to lose everything if I can't get to my clients. I'm sorry, Denise. That's awful, I said, and I meant it. What do you need? I found a car. It's used. It's not fancy, $4,200. But my credit is trash right now because of the repo, and I can't get approved on my own. She paused. I could hear her breathing, the particular quality of breath a person has when they've rehearsed a sentence in the shower that morning. I need someone to co-sign. Just co-sign, Claire. I'll make every payment. I already have a payment plan sketched out. I just need your name and your credit score to get the loan approved. That's it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I did not feel suspicious. I did not feel used. I felt mostly a kind of exhausted tenderness, the specific tiredness of a big sister who has spent 3 decades absorbing the family's low-grade, unspoken belief that she exists partly to catch her sister when she falls. I felt guilty for the fact that my own life had gone relatively smoothly, as though my stability were something I'd taken from a shared, limited pool of family luck, rather than something I'd built with 14-hour days and a decade of ramen dinners while I paid down my student loans. Let me think about it, I told her. I want to see the loan terms first. Of course, she said, too quickly, the relief already audible. Of course, take your time. I did not, in fact, take very much time. I called her back 2 days later and said yes. I want to pause here, in this early part of the story, and say something to anyone listening who recognizes themselves in what I'm describing. Anyone who has ever been the sister, the daughter, the responsible one, the person the family calls when there's a hole that needs filling. Saying yes to Denise that first time was not naive. It was not stupid. Co-signing a $4,200 used car loan for a sister who needed reliable transportation to keep her small business afloat is, by any reasonable measure, a generous but not an insane thing to do. If that had been where the story ended, I wouldn't be telling it to you now, 4 years and one entirely rebuilt life later. The problem was never the first yes. The problem was that in my family, one yes was never treated as an answer. It was treated as a precedent. The car loan closed in April. Denise made the first 3 payments on time, and I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how relieved I was, how closely I'd been watching my email for the auto-pay confirmation each month, how much of my own peace of mind I had quietly outsourced to my sister's follow-through. By July, the payments started coming in late. Not missed, just late. 5 days, then 8. Then a call from the lender because a payment had bounced. Denise apologized every time. She always had a story. A client had paid her late. Her hours got cut. There'd been a family emergency on her boyfriend's side that she'd had to help with financially. Every explanation was reasonable in isolation. Strung together, they formed a pattern I chose, for a long time, not to see. By September, I was making the payment myself most months, quietly, transferring money into her account 2 days before it was due so the autopay wouldn't bounce, telling myself it was a loan, that she'd pay me back once things stabilized, that this was temporary. I never told my parents I was covering the payments. I never told Denise I knew she wasn't the one actually making them anymore. There is a strange, specific shame in realizing you are being taken advantage of by someone you love, and the shame doesn't attach to the person taking advantage of you. It attaches to you, for allowing it, for staying quiet, for choosing the easier discomfort of enabling over the harder discomfort of confrontation. That might have been the whole story. A car loan quietly absorbed, a sister's flakiness quietly managed, A family dynamic quietly perpetuated for another decade the way it probably would have gone on forever if nothing else had happened. But then, the following spring, Denise called again. And this time, it wasn't about a car. "I found a house," she said. Her voice had a brightness to it I hadn't heard from her in years, an eagerness that in retrospect should have worried me more than any panic would have. "Claire, it's perfect. 3 bedrooms, a yard, good school district. Tyler's old enough now that I really want him settled somewhere before he starts kindergarten." Tyler was my nephew, 5 years old that spring, the son Denise had had with a man named Marcus, who had been gone from the picture since Tyler was 2. I loved Tyler with the specific fierce love an aunt develops for a child she has held since he was hours old, a child whose school photos sat framed on my own mantle, a child who called me Aunt Claire Bear because he couldn't say Claire Bennett. No, Whitfield. My mind still catches on the wrong name sometimes even now, when he was little, and it had simply stuck. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it, because a stable home for Tyler was something I wanted almost as much as Denise seemed to. "What do you need from me?" "The down payment," she said. "Just for the down payment. I've been saving, but with the car payment and everything, I'm still about 11,000 short of what I need for a good rate. And rents are only going up, Claire. If I don't buy now, I'm going to be stuck renting forever, and Tyler's going to grow up moving from apartment to apartment like I did." Her voice caught, just slightly, on that last part, and I understood she was invoking our own childhood, the 2 years we'd spent in a cramped 2-bedroom rental in a bad part of town before my father got the delivery route and things stabilized. "I'll pay you back. I've got it all worked out. I just need the 11,000 now, and I can pay you back 200 a month starting in the fall, once I pick up the extra cleaning clients I've got lined up." $11,000 was not nothing to me. I was doing well, but I wasn't wealthy. I had savings because I was careful, not because I was rich. And $11,000 represented a meaningful chunk of what I'd set aside over 4 years for a kitchen renovation I'd been putting off, plus a little more besides. I told her I needed to think about it, and this time I meant it more seriously than I had with the car. I called my mother, which in retrospect was its own kind of mistake, because I wasn't really calling for advice. I was calling for permission to say no, hoping someone would give me the words. "Well, of course you should help her if you can," my mother said, in the tone of voice she used when a question had, in her mind, only one possible answer. "She's trying to buy a house for my grandson, Claire. You have the money sitting there. What are you saving it for?" "I was going to redo my kitchen, Mom. It's been 11 years. Your kitchen works fine. Denise needs stability for that boy. You don't have children of your own." She said this gently, or what she believed was gently, but it landed the way it always landed, like a small blade slid neatly between 2 ribs. "So I know it might be hard for you to understand how urgent this feels for her. But you have this money and she doesn't. And family helps family." I did not point out that family helps family in our house had only ever run in one direction. I did not say that I had been the one lending, giving, covering, absorbing since I was 18 years old, while Denise had never once, not once, been in a position to help me, largely because she had never built the kind of stable life from which help could flow outward. I didn't say any of that because saying it would have required a version of myself I hadn't grown into yet. So instead, 3 days later, I transferred $11,000 to my sister's account, and she closed on a 3-bedroom colonial in a good school district in Huber Heights. And at the closing dinner my parents threw to celebrate, my father raised a glass and said, "To family taking care of family." And everyone looked at Denise when they said cheers, and nobody looked at me at all. I told myself, driving home that night, that this was fine, that this was what love looked like sometimes, that Tyler having a good school district was worth more than a kitchen renovation, And that was true. It genuinely was. And I don't regret that particular gift even now, even knowing everything I know. What I regret is not asking myself, that night, what would happen to the shape of my own life if this became the pattern instead of the exception? If every year brought a new emergency, a new need, a new reason why my savings existed primarily to solve my sister's problems while my own future quietly went unbuilt. I found out the answer to that question the following winter, and it very nearly broke me. The trouble started, as trouble in my family always seemed to start, with a phone call I received while I was doing something ordinary. I was standing in the frozen food aisle of the Kroger on Wilmington Pike, deciding between two brands of green beans, when my phone buzzed with a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I wish, some days, that I had. "Is this Claire Whitfield?" a man's voice asked, brisk and vaguely apologetic in the way of someone reading from a script. "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Regional Auto Finance calling regarding an account associated with your name. We've made several attempts to reach the primary account holder, Denise Whitfield, and have been unable to secure a response. As the cosigner on this account, you're being notified that the loan is now 90 days past due, and the vehicle is subject to repossession if payment isn't received within 10 business days." I stood very still in front of the green beans, the cold air from the freezer case pressing against my shins, and felt something in my chest drop the way it does on the first big hill of a roller coaster. "I'm sorry," I said. "90 days? I've been making the payments myself. I set up a transfer to her account every month." "According to our records, ma'am, the transfers stopped in September." I had not, in fact, stopped the transfers. I checked, standing right there in the store, pulling up my banking app with hands that had gone slightly unsteady. The transfers had gone through every month, right on schedule, into Denise's account. What had apparently not happened was Denise using that money to pay the car loan. I called her from the parking lot before I'd even finished checking out, my cart of half-purchased groceries abandoned at the customer service desk. "Denise, what is going on with the car payment? I just got a call saying you're 90 days behind." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything before any words arrive. "I had to use that money for the mortgage," she finally said. "The house payment went up because of the escrow adjustment, and I didn't want to lose the house, Claire. I figured the car was less important than keeping Tyler's home." "You didn't think to call me? You didn't think to tell me you were choosing not to pay a loan that has my name and my credit on it?" I was going to catch it up. I thought I could catch it up before it became a real problem. I didn't know they'd call you this fast. 90 days is not fast, Denise. 90 days is 3 months of you letting my credit get destroyed without saying a single word to me about it. I paid the arrears that afternoon, standing in my kitchen with my coat still on, $2,200 transferred directly to the lender to stop the repossession clock, my hands shaking with an anger I didn't yet have full permission to feel, because some old, deep part of me was still busy translating that anger into guilt, still asking whether I was somehow the unreasonable one for being upset. That was the first time I understood, really understood, that something had shifted. This was not a sister occasionally needing help. This was a sister who had begun to treat my name, my credit, my labor, as a kind of family utility, a resource that existed to be drawn on whenever her own resources ran short, without the courtesy of being told when the drawing was happening. I should have stopped there. I know that now with the particular clarity that only comes from the other side of a disaster. I should have called Denise, told her the car loan was her responsibility from that point forward, told her I would not be checking or covering anything else, and meant it. Instead, I did what I had always done. I absorbed it, I forgave it, and 3 months later, when she called again, this time about the house, I picked up the phone. "Claire, I need to talk to you about something. and I need you to not freak out. Every sentence that begins that way is, in my experience, the prelude to something worth freaking out about. I'm behind on the mortgage, she said. Pretty behind. Like 4 months behind. 4 months, Denise? How is that even possible? I thought the escrow adjustment was the whole problem, and that was months ago. It's not just the escrow. I lost 2 of my cleaning clients over the summer, and the freelance work dried up almost completely. And I've been using credit cards to cover the gap, and now the cards are maxed, and the mortgage company is talking about foreclosure. Claire, they're talking about taking the house, Tyler's house, and I don't know what else to do. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd first heard about the car loan 2 years earlier, and felt the particular vertigo of watching a pattern you've been refusing to name finally become undeniable. How much do you need? It wasn't really a question by that point. It was closer to a surrender. 19,000, to catch up the mortgage and pay off enough of the cards that I can actually breathe again. I know it's a lot, Claire, I know, and I hate asking. I hate that I keep having to ask you, but I don't have anyone else. Mom and Dad don't have that kind of money, and I can't lose this house. I can't put Tyler through that. I want to tell you that I said no. I want to tell you that this was the moment I found my spine, 4 years before I actually found it. But the truth is more complicated and less flattering, and I promised myself I would tell this story honestly, even the parts where I don't come across as wise. I said yes again. But this time, I said yes with conditions, because some instinct finally, some small hardened kernel of self-preservation, insisted on it. I'll help you, I told her. But I need this in writing. A real agreement, an actual promissory note, with a repayment schedule and interest drawn up properly. And I need to see your full financial picture. Every card, every balance, every bill, because I am not going to hand over $19,000 into a situation I don't understand. Denise agreed to everything on the phone. She agreed enthusiastically, in fact, in the specific way people agree to terms they have no intention of actually honoring, because agreement in the moment costs nothing, and the money is what's needed right now. I drafted a simple promissory note myself, using a template I found through a legal document service, outlining the loan, the repayment terms, $300 a month for just over 5 years, and had her sign it in front of a notary at my bank. I felt, signing that document alongside her, a strange mixture of relief and foreboding, as though I had finally done something adult and protective, while simultaneously suspecting that a piece of paper was not going to change the fundamental physics of my sister's life, which seemed to generate financial gravity wells no matter how much I filled them in. I was right to suspect that. Denise made 4 payments on the promissory note over the following year. 4, out of what should have been 12. Each missed payment came with an explanation, delivered with the particular fluency of someone who had, whether consciously or not, become excellent at the art of the plausible excuse. Car repairs, a dental emergency for Tyler, a slow month for the cleaning business, a friend's wedding she'd had to travel for and couldn't really afford, but felt she had to attend. I stopped believing the explanations somewhere around the 8th missed payment, though I kept accepting them out loud, because by then I had started to understand something uncomfortable about my own role in all of this. I had, without ever intending to, made myself into the load-bearing wall of my sister's entire financial life. If I said no, if I stopped, the whole structure she'd built, the house, the car, Tyler's stability, the story our parents told at family gatherings about how well Denise was doing now that she'd gotten settled, all of it would come down, and everyone, including Denise herself, seemed to understand this without anyone ever saying it aloud. I had become, in the quiet architecture of my family, not a sister, but a foundation, and foundations are not supposed to have opinions about what gets built on top of them. The moment that changed everything for me did not, in the end, come from Denise directly. It came from a loan officer named Patricia at Fifth Third Bank, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a manner so gently apologetic that I knew before she finished her sentence that something was badly wrong. I had gone in to refinance my own mortgage. Rates had dropped, my house in Kettering had appreciated nicely, and I'd finally, after years of postponing it, decided to do the kitchen renovation I'd been dreaming about since before the first car loan ever came up. I'd saved carefully, budgeted conservatively, and expected the refinance to be a formality. My income was strong, my payment history on my own mortgage was spotless, and I'd been a Fifth Third customer for 11 years. "Ms. Whitfield," Patricia said, looking at her screen with the particular stillness of someone deciding how to deliver bad news, "I'm seeing some things on your credit report that are going to be a problem for the rate you were hoping for. Were you aware there's a delinquent account here? A car loan, co-signed, 30 days past due currently, with 2 prior 90-day late marks in the past 2 years? And this note here, a personal loan of $19,000, also showing as a joint obligation?" "The car loan and the personal loan aren't mine," I said. "I mean, my name is on them, but they're my sister's. I co-signed to help her." "I understand," Patricia said, and I could tell from her face that she had had this exact conversation with other people before, that there was an entire category of person who walked into her office believing their credit was their own and discovered otherwise. But co-signing means the account reports on your credit exactly as if it were yours. The late payments, the balance, all of it factors into your debt-to-income ratio and your score, regardless of who's actually making the payments. Right now, between these two accounts, you're carrying about $31,000 of debt that isn't in your daily control, and it's dropped your score by almost 90 points over the past 2 years. 90 points. I sat in that chair and did the mental arithmetic of exactly how much of my adult life, the years of ramen dinners, the decade of careful saving, the discipline of paying every single bill of my own on time every single month without fail, had just been quietly cannibalized by someone else's carelessness, someone else's choices, someone else's life. "What does this mean for the refinance?" I asked, already knowing. "I can still get you approved, but not at the rate you were hoping for. You're looking at almost 1.5 points higher than you'd have qualified for 18 months ago, based on where your score was then." 1.5 points on a mortgage the size of mine was not a small number. It was, over the life of the loan, tens of thousands of dollars. Money that would leave my pocket over the coming decades. Not because of anything I had done, but because I had said yes to my sister 3 times and never fully understood what saying yes was actually costing me until a stranger with reading glasses laid it out in a spreadsheet. I did not cry in the bank, though I wanted to. I drove home, sat down at my kitchen table for what felt like the 1,000th time in this story, and pulled every single document related to Denise's loans that I could find. The original car loan paperwork, the promissory note, my bank statements going back 3 years. I built a spreadsheet, because building spreadsheets is the thing I know how to do when the rest of my life feels unmanageable, and the spreadsheet told me something I had been avoiding knowing in exact numbers for a long time. Between the money I had directly given Denise, the $11,000 for the house down payment, the $19,000 for the mortgage arrears, the smaller amounts here and there for things I'd stopped even tracking because they felt too petty to record, and the money I had spent quietly covering missed payments on the car loan to protect my own credit, I had transferred, loaned, or absorbed just over $52,000 over 4 years. Of that, Denise had repaid, in total, according to the promissory note's payment history, $4,200. $52,000 is not an abstraction. It was the down payment on a second property I had been quietly dreaming about. A little lake house 2 hours north, where I'd pictured myself retiring one day. It was 3 years of maximum retirement contributions I hadn't been able to make because the money kept getting redirected elsewhere. It was, in very concrete terms, a meaningfully different life than the one I was currently living. And I had given it away one guilt-soaked phone call at a time, telling myself each time that this was the last time, that family helps family, that Denise would turn things around. I called my sister that evening, and for the first time in 4 years, I did not soften my voice before I spoke. Denise, I was just at the bank trying to refinance my own house, and I found out my credit score has dropped 90 points because of your accounts. 90 points, Denise. Do you understand what that costs me? I know I've been behind, I know. You're 30 days late on the car again right now, as we're talking. And you have paid back 4,000 of the 19 I gave you 2 years ago. I need you to actually hear that number. 4,000 of 19,000. Things have just been really hard, Claire. I'm not doing this on purpose. You make it sound like I'm scheming against you. I'm not saying you're scheming, I said. And this was true. I didn't believe, even then, that Denise had ever consciously plotted to take advantage of me. I believed something both simpler and somehow sadder, that she had never had to develop the muscle of genuine accountability because I had always been there to absorb the consequences before she had to feel them. I'm saying that whether or not you mean to, the effect on my life is the same. I am not a bank, Denise. I am not an infinite resource. I have my own future I'm supposed to be building. And for 4 years I've been building yours instead of mine. There was a long silence on the line, and then Denise said something that I have turned over in my mind more times than almost anything else in this entire story. She said, I don't know why you're acting like this is all my fault. You're the one who has money. You're the one who never had to deal with real struggle. Maybe if you actually understood what it's like to not have things handed to you, you'd have a little more compassion. I sat with that sentence for a long moment before I responded, because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what she was telling me. My sister, who had received over $50,000 of my money, who had never once, in 39 years of life, sent me so much as a birthday check, who had been handed a car and a house payment through my labor and my credit, was telling me that things had been handed to me. I worked 2 jobs through college, I said quietly. I have never once asked you or mom or dad for $1 in my adult life. Everything I have, I built myself, on top of a childhood where I was told constantly that I needed to be the responsible one so that everyone else didn't have to be. I am done, Denise. I am done covering the car loan. I am done being your bank. From this point forward, your accounts are your responsibility, and if you miss a payment, that is between you and the lender. You can't just abandon me like this. What about Tyler? Are you really going to let your nephew lose his house over this? And there it was. The sentence that, for 4 years, had been the master key that unlocked every door in me, the invocation of a 5-year-old's stability as the final, unanswerable argument for my continued sacrifice. I felt the old pull of it, the reflexive guilt rising in my chest like water finding its familiar channel. And then, for the first time, I noticed something else alongside the guilt. A small, clear, cold clarity. The recognition that using a child's welfare as a financial lever was not, in fact, a form of love. It was a form of leverage, and I had been letting it work on me for years. Tyler's housing is not my responsibility to secure through my own financial ruin, I said. It's yours. I love him. I will always love him. But loving him does not mean I owe you my entire future. I hung up the phone that night feeling something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. Not guilt, not obligation, but something closer to grief. Grief for the 4 years, for the 90 points, for the $52,000, and underneath all of it, grief for the realization that the family I had spent my whole life trying to hold up had never once, in all that holding, thought to ask what I might need in return. I did not know it yet. Sitting at that table with my ruined credit score and my spreadsheet of numbers I couldn't quite believe. But that phone call was the beginning of the end of the life I'd been living. It would take another 8 months, one more devastating betrayal, and a Thanksgiving dinner I will never forget for the rest of my days, before I finally understood exactly what I needed to do, and exactly how quietly I intended to do it. My mother has hosted Thanksgiving at the same house on Forest View Drive for as long as I've been alive. The tablecloth is the same one she's used since I was in elementary school, a cream-colored linen with a faint scorch mark near one corner from a candle incident in the 90s that nobody talks about anymore. The china is the same china. The seating arrangement. My father at the head, my mother at the foot, Denise and I flanking whichever side had the most recent addition, which for years now had meant Tyler squeezed in beside his mother, had calcified into something so ritualized it felt less like a family gathering and more like a reenactment. I almost didn't go that year. 8 months had passed since the phone call about my credit score. 8 months during which I had held, with what felt like superhuman effort, to the boundary I'd set. I had not covered a single car payment. I had not sent a single dollar toward the promissory note, which by that point Denise had stopped even pretending to service. I had, for the first time in 4 years, watched my sister's financial life unravel without reaching out my hand to catch it, and the watching had been its own kind of agony, a low, constant hum of anxiety I carried everywhere, the phantom limb sensation of a habit I was trying to break. I went to Thanksgiving because my father called me himself, which he almost never did, and said in his quiet, careful way, "Your mother would really like you there, Claire. All of us together. It's been a hard year." I heard, underneath that sentence, an unspoken appeal I couldn't quite name, and some part of me, the part that still, after everything, wanted desperately to be a good daughter, a good sister, a good aunt, said yes before I'd fully decided to. I should have trusted my instinct not to go. Dinner started normally enough. Tyler, 6 now, showed me a drawing he'd made at school of a dinosaur eating what he insisted was a turkey, but which looked, to my eye, considerably more like a small dog. My mother's turnip casserole was, as always, the one dish nobody particularly liked, and everyone took a polite spoonful of anyway. My father said the same grace he'd said every Thanksgiving of my life, the same 3 sentences about gratitude and family that I could recite in my sleep. For about 40 minutes, sitting at that table, I let myself believe the whole difficult year might simply be set aside, that we could all just eat turkey together and be, for one evening, an ordinary family. Then my mother set down her fork with a particular deliberateness I recognized from childhood, the deliberateness of someone about to deliver a speech she'd been composing all week, and said, "I want to talk about something, and I want everyone to just listen with an open heart before anyone gets upset." I felt my stomach drop before she'd said another word. "Denise is in real trouble," my mother continued. "She's going to lose the house, Harold. Tell her." This to my father, who nodded gravely, as though confirming a diagnosis. "The bank has sent a notice. They're starting foreclosure proceedings, and Tyler is going to lose his home right before Christmas if something doesn't change in the next few weeks." "Mom," I started. "Let me finish, Claire. I know you and Denise have had a falling out about money, and I'm not saying whose fault that is. I'm just saying that whatever's happened between the two of you, a 6-year-old boy should not have to pay the price for it. We are talking about a child losing his home at Christmas." I looked around the table. Denise was staring down at her plate, not meeting my eyes, And something about her posture told me this had all been planned, not a spontaneous outpouring of family concern, but a staged intervention, the whole extended family arranged around the table specifically to apply pressure at the moment I would find hardest to resist, surrounded by relatives, in the house I grew up in, with a child's Christmas hanging in the balance like a hostage. "How much does she need?" I asked, my voice flatter than I intended. 24,000, my mother said, to catch up everything and get current. Your father and I have put in what we can, which isn't much. We've got 4,000 saved, and Denise's boyfriend's family offered 1,000, but that still leaves 19 we don't have. $19,000. The exact number, again, as if the universe had a limited vocabulary of figures it intended to keep testing me with. I already gave her $19,000 2 years ago for this exact purpose, I said, for mortgage arrears. She was supposed to pay it back at $300 a month. She's paid back $4,200 total. Where did the rest of it go? Where did the mortgage payments themselves go? The ones I wasn't covering, that she should have been making from her own income this whole time. This isn't the moment to relitigate the past, Claire, my mother said, a note of sharpness entering her voice now. We're talking about right now. We're talking about Tyler. I am talking about right now, I said. I'm asking a very current, very relevant question, which is, what happened to the last $19,000? Because if I give another 19, I would like to actually understand whether that money goes toward fixing the problem or just delays it by another 18 months. Denise looked up then, her eyes wet, her voice small in a way that I recognized, with a strange, sick clarity, as a performance. Not because her distress wasn't real, but because I had watched this exact register of voice deployed at me so many times before that I could no longer separate genuine feeling from rehearsed effect. I've been struggling, Claire. I lost clients. I had medical bills for Tyler you don't even know about. Is it so hard to believe that life is just harder for some people than others? I believe life is hard for you, I said, and I meant it. I did believe that. I had never doubted that Denise's life contained real struggles. What I don't believe anymore is that money is the thing that fixes it. Because I have given you $52,000 over 4 years, and every single time, 18 months later, we are back at exactly this table having exactly this conversation. The table went silent in the particular way tables go silent when a number that large has been spoken aloud in a room full of people who didn't know it. And I watched my father's face change, watched him do some rapid, uncomfortable arithmetic of his own. 52,000, he repeated quietly. The car loan, the down payment, the mortgage arrears, and the smaller amounts in between that I stopped tracking because I was embarrassed by how often they were happening. I said, $52,000, Dad, and my credit score dropped 90 points because of it, and I got denied the refinance rate I should have qualified for, and I am still, 4 years later, sitting at this table being asked for 19 more. So what? Denise said, her voice rising now, the tears gone, replaced by something harder. You're going to let your nephew be homeless because you're mad about a credit score? You've always had so much more than me, Claire. You've never had to struggle for anything the way I have. And now that I actually need you, you're going to turn your back on family because of money? I want to describe, as precisely as I can, what happened inside me in the silence after she said that, because it is the exact moment my whole life changed direction. I felt the old guilt rise up exactly as it always had. The reflexive, bone-deep fear of being the sister who let a child lose his home, the daughter who disappointed her mother, the family member who chose herself over everyone else at the table. And then, for the first time, I watched that guilt arrive and simply did not act on it. I let it wash through me and recede, the way you let a wave pass over your feet at the beach without being knocked off balance by it. And in the space that opened up after the guilt passed, I found something I had never quite had access to before at that table: clarity. I have never turned my back on this family, I said, quietly, evenly. I have given more to this family in dollars and in years and in worry than anyone at this table has ever given me. And I am not willing to keep destroying my own future to delay the consequences of choices that aren't mine. If Denise loses the house, that is a devastating, real thing, and I am sorry for Tyler. Truly sorry. But it is not my responsibility to prevent it by handing over money that has never once actually solved the underlying problem, which is not a lack of money. It's a lack of anyone in this family ever having to face what happens when the money runs out. My mother's face had gone pale and furious. How dare you sit at this table and lecture your sister about accountability? You have no idea what it's like to raise a child alone. You have no idea what real struggle looks like. I don't need to have raised a child alone to understand what $52,000 and 90 credit points cost me, I said, and I'm done pretending I do. I left before dessert. I remember walking out to my car in the cold November dark, my father's porch light casting a long yellow rectangle across the driveway, and sitting behind the wheel for a long time before I turned the key, not crying, which surprised me, but simply breathing, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having said, out loud at that table, in front of everyone, the truth I had been swallowing for 4 years. I did not know, driving home that night, that I would not sit at that table again for almost 2 years. I did not know that within 4 months I would sell my house, resign from a job I'd held for 11 years, and move 600 miles away without telling anyone where I was going until I had already arrived. All I knew that November night was that something inside me had finally, after 4 decades, refused to bend the way it always had before, and that whatever came next, I was not going back to being the family's foundation, invisible and load-bearing, and never, ever asked what it needed to hold itself up. For 4 months after that Thanksgiving, my life settled into something I can only describe as watchful quiet. I did not call Denise. She did not call me, except for one text message in December. "Hope you're happy with yourself. We're spending Christmas figuring out storage units," which I read once and did not respond to, though I will admit it cost me something to leave it unanswered. Some old muscle in me straining against the new boundary like a dog against a leash it hasn't yet learned to accept. I heard through my mother in a stilted, careful phone call in January that Denise and Tyler had, in fact, lost the Huber Heights house. They hadn't ended up homeless. Denise moved into her boyfriend's apartment, a 2-bedroom in Fairborn, and Tyler transferred schools mid-year, which my mother mentioned with a specific, pointed sorrow clearly intended to reach me, though she didn't say anything so direct as, "This is your fault." She didn't need to. The implication sat in every pause. I grieved that news in a complicated way. I grieved for Tyler, who I loved, and who had done nothing to deserve any of this. I grieved, too, for the version of myself who might have simply written the check and avoided the whole confrontation, even though I knew, with the part of my mind that had finally learned to trust its own reasoning, that writing the check would only have purchased another 18 months before we arrived at the exact same crisis, 1 house and 1 relocation later. What I did not expect, what none of my careful new boundaries had prepared me for, arrived in a plain white envelope from Fifth Third Bank in late February. I remember opening it standing at my own kitchen counter, expecting a statement, and instead finding a letter regarding a home equity line of credit application submitted under my name, using my Social Security number, listing my Kettering address as the property to be used as collateral, requesting a credit limit of $35,000. The letter was, in fact, a denial. The application had been flagged for review because the listed applicant's existing mortgage lender, Fifth Third itself, already held records showing I had not applied for any such line of credit, and an internal fraud alert had automatically triggered a hold. I stood in my kitchen and read that letter 3 times before the meaning of it fully assembled itself in my mind. Someone had applied for a $35,000 loan against my house, using my identity, without my knowledge. I called the bank's fraud department within the hour, my hands, for the second time in this story, shaking in a way I couldn't quite control. The representative, a careful, kind woman named Deb, walked me through the application. It had been submitted online 3 weeks earlier. It listed my correct Social Security number, my correct date of birth, my correct address, my correct existing mortgage account number. All information that, I realized with a slow, sick understanding, existed together in exactly one place. The folder of documents I had compiled 2 years earlier, the spreadsheet and the paperwork I'd gathered while trying to understand exactly how much of my credit had already been consumed by Denise's accounts. A folder I had, at one point during that terrible year, shared with Denise herself, over email, because she had asked to see the full picture, so she could, in her words, understand what she owed and make a real plan to pay it back. I had sent my sister a document containing my Social Security number, my mortgage account details, and my full financial history, believing she wanted it to build a repayment plan. She had instead apparently kept it, and 18 months later, in the depths of losing her house, used it to attempt to open $35,000 of credit in my name without asking me, without telling me, and this was the detail that finally, completely, dissolved whatever remained of my capacity for excuses on her behalf. Without any plan, as far as I could tell, to ever inform me the application existed at all. If Fifth Third's fraud system hadn't flagged it, if the loan had gone through under a different lender with a less careful process, I would very likely have discovered a $35,000 lien against my own house months or years later, with no memory of ever agreeing to it, because I never had. I called Denise that evening. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because the tone of this final conversation with my sister mattered enormously to me, then and now. I did not want to give her, or myself, a version of this story where I was the one who finally lost control. I got a letter from Fifth Third today, I said, about a HELOC application for $35,000, using my Social Security number and my house as collateral. Do you know anything about that? The silence on the line was long enough that I understood the answer before she spoke. Claire, I can explain. I'm not asking for an explanation right now, I said. I'm asking you a yes or no question. Did you submit an application for a home equity line of credit using my identity and my house? Another long pause. Then quietly, yes. Why? Because I was desperate, Claire. Because after the house and after everything, I had nowhere else to turn, and I knew if I asked you directly you'd say no, and I thought if I could just get the money and pay it back quietly before you ever found out, it would solve everything and you'd never even have to know it happened. I sat with that answer for a long moment, turning it over, because I think it is, in its own terrible way, one of the most honest things my sister ever said to me. She had not been confused about whether this was wrong. She had understood, clearly enough to plan around it, that I would say no if asked, and she had decided that my consent was an obstacle to root around rather than a boundary to respect. 4 years of car loans and mortgage arrears and broken promissory notes had all, at least, involved my agreement, however reluctant, however guilt-extracted. This was different in kind, not just in degree. This was my sister deciding, quite deliberately, that my ownership over my own name, my own credit, my own house, was negotiable without my participation, as long as she could do it quietly enough that I'd never notice. "I need you to understand something," I said, and my voice, when it came out, was steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "This is not a family disagreement about money anymore. This is identity theft. That is the actual legal term for what you did. I could report this to the police right now tonight, and you could be charged with a felony." "Please, Claire, please don't do that. I have Tyler, please." "I'm not going to report you," I said, and I watched her breath catch with relief on the other end of the line before I finished my sentence. "Not because you don't deserve consequences. You do. But because I have decided that the consequence I actually want is not to see you in a courtroom. It's to remove myself completely from your life and from this family's finances, permanently, so that this can never happen to me again. I am done, Denise. Not on pause, not needing space. Done. I will not co-sign anything else. I will not lend anything else. I will not have another conversation about money with you for as long as I live. And I am going to spend the next several months making absolutely certain that you have no access, none, to any piece of my financial life ever again." "You don't mean that. We're sisters." "We are sisters," I agreed. "And you used that fact to try to take $35,000 from me without my knowledge, after already taking $52,000 with it. I don't know what being sisters is supposed to mean after that, but I know it doesn't mean what I used to think it meant." I hung up the phone, and I did not cry, and I did not call my mother to tell her what had happened, though eventually, months later, she would find out anyway, in a conversation I'll describe further along in this story. That night, sitting alone in my kitchen with the fraud letter still on the counter in front of me, I did something I had never once done in 45 years of life. I made a decision entirely for myself, with no consideration whatsoever for how it would affect my sister, my mother, my father, or anyone else in the family I had spent my whole life quietly holding up. I decided to leave. Not leave the family, exactly. I wasn't naive enough to think a person could simply excise her entire biological history the way you'd cancel a subscription, but leave the state, leave the job, leave the house with all its memories of loan documents signed at that kitchen table. Leave the entire physical and financial ecosystem in which I had spent 4 decades being defined as the responsible one, the one who gives, the one who holds things together, and go somewhere no one knew that story about me at all. Somewhere I could find out who I was when I wasn't holding anyone up but myself. It took me 4 months to execute that decision properly. I want to walk through those 4 months carefully, because I think the planning matters just as much as the leaving. Because the version of this story where I simply fled in the middle of the night, dramatic and unprepared, would have been a much smaller act of self-respect than the version where I built, quietly and deliberately, an entire exit from a life that no longer served me, brick by brick, before I ever said a word to anyone about what I was doing. The first thing I did, the morning after that phone call with Denise, was change every password to every financial account I owned. Bank logins, credit card portals, my retirement accounts, my email, all of it. New passwords, new security questions with answers that had nothing to do with real facts about my life that anyone in my family could guess. I placed a security freeze on my credit with all 3 bureaus, which meant no one, including me, could open new credit in my name without first lifting the freeze with a PIN only I possessed. I filed a police report about the HELOC application, not to pursue charges, but because Deb at the fraud department told me having an official report on file would make any future disputes far easier to resolve, and because some part of me needed the fact of what had happened to exist somewhere official, documented, real, outside the fog of family denial I knew would eventually descend around it. Then I did something I had never seriously considered before in my life. I called a career counselor. Her name was Inez, and she worked out of a small office above a coffee shop in downtown Dayton. And in our first session, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. If money and family obligation weren't part of the equation at all, she said, where would you want to be living in 2 years? And what would you want to be doing? I sat in her office and realized I had genuinely never asked myself that question. Not once, not in 45 years. Every major decision of my adult life had been made in reference to something else. Proximity to my parents, availability to help Denise, the practical logistics of a life oriented around being useful to people who were not, it turned out, particularly oriented around being useful back. I've always liked the mountains, I said slowly, surprising myself with how immediate the answer came once I actually let myself look for it. I went to Asheville once for a conference years ago, and I remember thinking I could live somewhere like that. Somewhere with actual seasons and actual hills and actual quiet. What about work? What would you want to be doing if you could design it from scratch? I had, by that point in my career, 11 years at the same accounting firm in Dayton, handling tax and audit work for small manufacturers, work I was good at but had never particularly loved. What I had always secretly wanted, in the part of my mind I rarely let myself visit, was to work directly with small business owners, not as an employee of a firm handling their compliance paperwork, but as an independent advisor helping them actually build something, understand their numbers, make real decisions instead of just filing forms after the fact. I think I'd want my own practice, I said. Advisory work. Helping people actually understand their businesses, not just filing their taxes. Inez nodded slowly. That's a real answer. Now let's talk about what it would actually take to get there. Over the following 4 months, working with Inez on the side of my regular job, I built a plan with a level of care I had genuinely never applied to my own life before, having spent so many years applying exactly that level of care to solving other people's emergencies instead. I researched Asheville's market for financial advisory services. I studied the licensing requirements for starting an independent CPA practice in North Carolina. I built a financial model, the same kind of spreadsheet I'd once built to quantify what Denise had cost me, now turned toward building something instead of documenting a loss. Projecting exactly how many months of savings I'd need to sustain myself while I built a client base from scratch. I sold my house in Kettering in April to a young couple expecting their first child, and cried a little in the driveway on closing day, not because I regretted selling it, but because so much of my adult life had happened inside those walls. The loan documents signed at that kitchen table, the phone calls with Denise, the years of quiet, unexamined giving. Selling it felt like closing a chapter I had never quite chosen to be in, and opening one I was, for the first time, choosing entirely for myself. I gave my notice at the accounting firm in May, sitting across from my managing partner, a kind, tired man named Gerald Okafor who had mentored me for a decade, and telling him I was leaving to start my own practice in North Carolina. He was surprised. I had never given any indication of restlessness, had always been, in his words, the most reliable person in this building. But he was also, in his careful, generous way, entirely supportive, and offered to refer 3 of the firm's smaller clients to me if they ever wanted an independent advisor after I'd left, an offer that turned out, months later, to matter enormously to my early success. The hardest part of the entire 4 months was deciding what, if anything, to tell my parents. I went back and forth on this for weeks. Part of me wanted to simply disappear, to move without a word and let them discover, eventually, on their own, that I was gone. But I decided, in the end, that vanishing without explanation would be its own kind of dishonesty, a way of making my leaving about punishing them rather than about building the life I actually wanted. So in June, 3 weeks before my planned move, I drove to my parents' house on Forest View Drive one final time, sat at their kitchen table, not the scene of a confrontation this time, just my mother's ordinary kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and told them what I had decided. "I'm moving to Asheville," I said. "I've sold the house. I've left the firm. I'm starting my own practice there. I'm telling you because you're my parents and I love you, not because I'm asking for permission or expecting you to be happy about it." My mother's face went through several expressions in quick succession: shock, then something that looked almost like fear, then a kind of brittle composure. "This is about Denise," she said. "You're punishing all of us because of what happened with your sister." "This is about me," I said as gently as I could manage. "I have spent my entire adult life organizing my decisions around what this family needs. I am not doing that anymore. I love you both. I will call you. But I am not going to keep living the life I've been living, and I need you to understand that this decision isn't a negotiation." My father, who had said very little through the whole conversation, finally spoke. "Are you safe? Are you doing this because you're okay, or because you're running from something?" It was, I think, the kindest and most honest question anyone asked me during that entire period, and I answered it as honestly as I could. "I'm doing this because I finally understand that I get to have a life that's mine," I said. "I'm not running away from anything, Dad. I'm running toward something, for the first time in longer than I can remember." He nodded slowly and reached across the table and squeezed my hand and said, "Then I'm glad, even if I don't fully understand it." It was the closest thing to blessing I received from either parent that day, and I have held on to it, in the years since, more tightly than almost anything else from that entire chapter of my life. I did not tell Denise I was leaving at all. I did not owe her that conversation, and some clear-eyed part of me understood that telling her would only invite one final attempt at reconciliation as leverage, one final plea framed around Tyler's needs or her own desperation, timed specifically to derail the one truly self-directed decision I had ever made. I let my parents decide what, if anything, to tell her. I found out much later that my mother had, in fact, told her almost immediately, and that Denise's reaction, relayed to me secondhand many months afterward, had been a mixture of genuine hurt and a kind of disbelieving anger, as though the idea that I might simply build a life elsewhere, beyond the reach of her next emergency, had never seriously occurred to her as a possibility. On a Saturday morning in late June, 4 months almost to the day after that letter arrived from Fifth Third Bank, I loaded 2 suitcases and 6 boxes of belongings into a rented cargo van, said goodbye to the empty house on Forsythia Court that had already, technically, belonged to someone else for 6 weeks, and drove south and east out of Ohio as the sun came up, toward a city I had visited exactly once, to build a life I had designed entirely by myself, for the first time in 46 years. I did not look in the rearview mirror very much that morning. I looked forward, at the road, at the hills beginning to rise up ahead of me somewhere past the Kentucky line, and I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember, something that took me almost an hour of driving to correctly identify, because it had been absent from my life for so long that I'd nearly forgotten its name. I felt light. The apartment I rented in Asheville was small, a 1-bedroom above a used bookstore on a slightly sloped street in West Asheville, with a window unit air conditioner that rattled like it was auditioning for a percussion section, and a view, if you leaned far enough out the bathroom window, of a sliver of blue mountain ridge in the distance. It was, in every practical sense, a significant downgrade from the 3-bedroom colonial I'd owned in Kettering. I loved it more than any home I'd ever lived in. I loved it because nobody who lived in that building, worked in that bookstore, or passed me on that sloped street had the faintest idea who Claire Whitfield was supposed to be. I was not the responsible one. I was not the sister with the ruined credit score, or the daughter who'd finally, shockingly, said no. I was simply a woman in her mid-40s who had just moved to town, and the blankness of that anonymity felt, in those first weeks, less like loneliness than like an enormous, unfamiliar kind of freedom. The freedom to decide, in each new interaction, exactly who I wanted to be, without the gravitational pull of 4 decades of family expectation dragging me back into old patterns. The first month was hard in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even with all my careful planning. I missed Tyler with a specific physical ache some mornings, a longing to see his drawings and hear his particular 6-year-old laugh that had nothing to do with Denise at all, and everything to do with loving a child I had, in leaving, also had to leave behind. I called him twice that first month, careful, brief calls arranged through my mother, and I sent him a postcard of the Blue Ridge Parkway with a $5 bill folded inside, and I told myself, with more hope than certainty, that this was not goodbye forever, just goodbye to the version of my life where his mother's emergencies were also automatically mine. I registered my practice, Whitfield Advisory Group, within 3 weeks of arriving, working out of the corner of my apartment with a laptop and a secondhand desk I'd found at an estate sale. And I spent the first 2 months doing something I had never done in 11 years at the Dayton firm. I built my own client list from nothing, one conversation at a time. I joined the local Chamber of Commerce. I went to small business networking breakfasts where I knew absolutely no one, standing awkwardly by the coffee urn with a name tag that said, Claire Whitfield, Whitfield Advisory Group, in a hand that occasionally trembled, not from nerves about the work. I knew the work cold, 11 years of it, but from the strange vertigo of introducing myself as something other than an employee for the first time in my career. My first client was a woman named Renata Cortez, who owned a small ceramic studio and gift shop in the River Arts District, and who hired me, in August, to help her understand why her business felt busy all the time, but never seemed to have any money left over at the end of the month. I sat with her books for a week, built her a cash flow model, and identified, the way I'd been trained to for 11 years, but now doing it for myself, on my own terms, taking the full credit and the full risk, that she was pricing 3 of her most popular product lines below the actual cost of materials and labor, effectively subsidizing her most enthusiastic customers out of her own pocket every single month without realizing it. There is a particular satisfaction in helping someone see, clearly for the first time, exactly where their resources have been quietly leaking away without their notice. A satisfaction I understood, with an intimacy that had nothing to do with my professional training and everything to do with my own life. I built Renata a new pricing model, walked her through it line by line, and watched her face shift from confusion to something like relief as the numbers finally made sense to her. She hugged me at the end of that meeting, unprompted, and told me it was the first time in 4 years of running her business that anyone had actually helped her understand her own money instead of just filing her taxes for her. Renata told 2 other business owners about me. Those 2 told 3 more. By November, 5 months after I'd arrived in Asheville with 2 suitcases and a rented cargo van, I had 11 regular clients, a referral from Gerald Okafor back in Dayton that turned into a 12th, and enough income to stop drawing down my savings and start, cautiously, rebuilding them instead. I want to be honest that the early months were not some uninterrupted montage of triumphant self-actualization. There were nights I sat alone in that small apartment above the bookstore and cried, missing Tyler, missing the easy familiarity of a city I'd lived in my whole life, wondering whether I had made a rash and selfish decision that I would eventually regret. There were moments of genuine loneliness, the specific loneliness of being new in a place at an age when most people have already built their social circles and settled into their routines, when making a single new friend takes far more deliberate effort than it did at 25. I joined a hiking group specifically because Inez, my career counselor back in Dayton, had told me on our last call together that building a new life required building new community on purpose, not waiting for it to happen accidentally the way it mostly had in my 20s. That hiking group, as it turned out, gave me one of the most important relationships of this entire chapter of my life, a woman named Priya Desai, a physical therapist about my age who had moved to Asheville 8 years earlier after her own divorce, and who understood, with an immediacy that felt like recognition, exactly what it meant to rebuild a life from a decision nobody else in your old life had wanted you to make. "The thing nobody tells you," Priya said to me one Saturday morning, the two of us pausing on a ridge overlook somewhere along the Mountains to Sea trail, both of us breathing hard from the climb, "is that the people who benefited from the old version of you will always tell you the new version is selfish. That's not information about you. That's just information about what they lost." I turned that sentence over in my mind for a long time after she said it, on the drive home, in the shower that evening, lying awake that night in my small bedroom with the window cracked to let in the cool mountain air. It was, I think, the single most useful thing anyone said to me during the entire 2 years I spent rebuilding my life in Asheville, because it gave me language for something I had felt but never been able to articulate. That my mother's accusation, that leaving was punishment, that leaving was selfishness, had never actually been a moral observation. It had been a description of loss from the perspective of the person losing something, dressed up as an ethical judgment so that I would feel obligated to reverse course and give it back. I did not give it back. I kept building. And slowly, month by month, client by client, hike by hike, dinner by dinner with Priya and the small, unhurried circle of friends I began to accumulate in that city that had never known me as anyone's foundation, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. The sensation of a life that was actually, entirely, unmistakably mine. By the end of my first full year in Asheville, Whitfield Advisory Group had 23 regular clients, a proper office, a converted storefront on Haywood Road with exposed brick and good light, which I chose specifically because it made me happy to walk into it every morning, a criterion I had never once applied to any workspace in my entire previous career. And, for the first time since I'd started supporting Denise's finances alongside my own, a savings rate that actually reflected my income rather than being quietly siphoned off towards someone else's emergencies. I want to talk honestly about what that felt like, because I think it's easy in a story like this to skip past the financial details as though they're crass or beside the point, when in fact they were the entire point. Money is never really just money, it's time, it's choices. It's the difference between a life where you're constantly triaging crises and a life where you get to actually plan. In my first year in Asheville, I put more into my retirement accounts than I had in the previous 4 years combined. I started, cautiously, looking at that lake property idea again, not the specific lake 2 hours north of Dayton I'd once dreamed about, but a small cabin an hour outside Asheville, near Lake Lure, that I began visiting on weekends, walking the property with a real estate agent, imagining, slowly, tentatively, a future that included something purely for my own joy rather than purely in service of someone else's need. I hired my first employee that spring, a recent accounting graduate named Marcus Webb, sharp and eager and slightly terrified of client-facing work in the specific way very smart 24-year-olds often are. And I found, mentoring him, an unexpected echo of a version of care I actually wanted to give. Not the compulsive, boundaryless giving I'd spent 4 years extending toward Denise, but a chosen, structured, mutual kind of investment where I taught him things and he, in turn, took real client work off my plate and grew into someone genuinely valuable to the practice. Priya and I had, by that point, become close enough friends that we spent most Sunday mornings together, either hiking or simply sitting on her porch with coffee, and it was on one of those Sunday mornings, about 14 months after I'd arrived in Asheville, that she asked me a question that surprised me with how easily I answered it. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Leaving, I mean. All of it." I thought about the question seriously before answering, because I wanted to give her a true answer, not a performed one. "I regret that it took me 46 years to understand I was allowed to have boundaries," I said. "I regret the $52,000, some days, in a very concrete way. I think about what that money could have built if it had been mine to build with from the start. But leaving itself? No. Leaving is the only decision I've ever made entirely for myself, and it turns out that was the decision that finally let me build something real." "What about your family?" "I miss my nephew every single day," I said, and this was true, and remains true even now. I miss the version of my parents who existed before money became the only language between us. I don't know if I miss Denise exactly, so much as I miss the sister I always hoped she'd eventually become, the one who never quite arrived. I heard from my family, during that first year, in careful, sporadic bursts. My father called every few weeks, brief, warm calls about nothing in particular. The weather, a home repair he was tackling, a question about whether I'd found a good dentist in my new city. Calls that felt, in their studied avoidance of anything difficult, like his own quiet way of maintaining a bridge between us without ever forcing me to walk back across it. My mother called less often, and when she did, the calls carried an undertone I recognized immediately. A hope, never quite spoken aloud, that enough time had passed for me to reconsider, to come back, to resume my old position in the family's architecture. "Denise is doing better," she told me during one such call, about 10 months after I'd left. "She got a full-time job at a dental office, if you can believe it. Receptionist work, steady hours. She and Tyler are settled in the Fairborn apartment. Things have calmed down a lot." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly glad, in a way that surprised me a little, that Denise had found some stability without my money propping it up. "She asks about you sometimes," my mother added, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual. "She misses you." I did not respond to that, the way I think my mother hoped I would, with some softening, some opening toward reconciliation. "I'm glad she's doing well," I said again, and left it there, because I had learned, over that first year of distance, that I did not owe an immediate emotional response every time Denise's feelings were reported to me secondhand. I could hold genuine goodwill toward her well-being without that goodwill obligating me to resume the financial relationship that had nearly destroyed my own life. It was during that second Christmas away, my second Thanksgiving and Christmas both spent in Asheville, the first year I'd ever missed both holidays with my family of origin, that I understood something had shifted permanently in me, not just as a temporary defensive posture, but as a genuine, settled feature of who I had become. I spent that Christmas with Priya and a small group of her friends who had by then become mine as well, cooking a meal together in her kitchen, exchanging small, thoughtful gifts, laughing at a table where nobody was calculating what anyone owed anyone else. I called my parents that afternoon, a warm, easy conversation, and I called Tyler too, now 7, who told me at great length about a video game he was obsessed with, his voice bright and uncomplicated in a way that made my chest ache with love and, underneath the love, a small permanent grief for the version of this relationship that distance had cost us both. I went to bed that Christmas night in my small apartment above the bookstore, full and warm and, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, entirely at peace. Not performing peace, not managing my way towards some acceptable version of contentment while quietly starving somewhere underneath, but actually, structurally, at peace, the way a house is at peace when its foundation finally sits level. I did not know, drifting off to sleep that night, that the following spring would bring the phone call that finally tested in the most concrete way possible everything I had built. The phone call in which my family, faced with a crisis far larger than any that had come before, would ask me to come back not just emotionally, but literally, and would discover, in my answer, exactly how much I had changed. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in April, almost exactly 2 years after I'd driven out of Ohio in a rented cargo van. I was at my office on Haywood Road, in the middle of a client meeting with a woman who ran a small brewery, walking her through a projection for a planned expansion, when my phone buzzed on silent in my bag. I didn't check it until the meeting ended 40 minutes later, and by then there were 6 missed calls from my mother and 1 text message that simply said, "Please call me the second you see this. It's about your father." I called from the small back office I used for storage, my heart already pounding before my mother even picked up. "He collapsed at the house this morning," she said, her voice tight and thin in a way I had never once heard from her in 48 years of being her daughter. "Heart attack. They took him to Miami Valley. He's stable, they say. They got him into surgery fast, but Claire, it was bad. It was really bad. I found him on the kitchen floor." I do not remember booking the flight. I remember standing in the small office, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mother's voice going in and out as she described the ambulance, the surgery, the doctor's careful, hedged language about cautiously optimistic outcomes. And I remember some deep, old part of me, the part that had spent 4 decades organizing itself around this family's emergencies, rising up instantly, without hesitation, because whatever complicated history existed between me and Denise, my father called small, my father squeezing my hand across that kitchen table 2 years earlier and asking if I was safe, was not a relationship I had ever wanted distance from. I had left a financial system. I had never left my father. I flew to Dayton the next morning and spent 4 days in the surgical waiting room and then the cardiac ICU at Miami Valley Hospital, alongside my mother, alongside Denise, in a strange, suspended version of family togetherness that neither of us had planned for, and neither of us, in that specific setting, seemed inclined to disrupt with old grievances. My father's surgery, a triple bypass, as it turned out, went well. He came out of it groggy but alert on the 2nd day, and by the 4th day, when he was moved to a regular recovery floor, the doctors were using words like excellent prognosis and full recovery expected within 3 months. And something in my chest that had been clenched tight since that first phone call finally began, slowly, to loosen. It was in the hospital cafeteria, on the 3rd day, over bad coffee and worse sandwiches, that Denise and I had our first real conversation in 2 years. She looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically so, but in the particular way people age when the last few years have been genuinely hard. Small lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. A tiredness in her posture that had nothing to do with the current crisis and everything to do with the accumulated weight of the ones before it. She looked, I realized with some surprise, very much like a person who had actually been through consequences in the 2 years since I'd left, rather than someone who had simply been angry at me from a distance. "I've been wanting to call you," she said, staring down at her coffee cup rather than at me. "For a long time. I just didn't know what I'd even say." "You could have started with anything," I said, not unkindly, but not softening the truth of it either. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I got the receptionist job at the dental office about a year and a half ago. Full-time, benefits, the whole thing. Tyler's doing really well in school. I've been paying my own bills, Claire. All of them. For the first time maybe ever, actually, if I'm being honest with myself." "That's good," I said, and I meant it, genuinely, without any complicated undertone. "I'm glad, Denise. I mean that." "I think about the HELOC thing all the time," she said, her voice dropping lower, and I understood, watching her say it, that this was the sentence she had actually flown all the way here, in her own mind, to say to me, even before the crisis with our father had made an in-person conversation possible at all. "I think about it, and I feel sick. Honestly, about who I was willing to be when I was desperate enough. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I don't think I've even fully forgiven myself for it. I just wanted you to know that I know what I did. And I know it wasn't just about a car loan anymore by that point. It was about whether I respected you as an actual person with an actual right to say no, and for a long time, I don't think I did. I think I saw you as, I don't know, a resource, not a sister. I'm sorry for that, Claire. I don't expect it to fix anything. I just needed to say it." I sat with that admission for a long moment, turning it over, checking it against everything I knew of my sister and everything I'd learned about myself in the 2 years since I'd left. I did not offer instant, easy forgiveness. That would have been, I think, its own kind of dishonesty. The old reflex of smoothing things over before they'd actually been fully felt. But I did feel something shift, some long-held tension easing slightly at the sound of an apology that, for the first time in this entire story, contained no request attached to it. No ask for money, no invocation of Tyler's needs as leverage, just an acknowledgement, offered without expectation of anything in return. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "I believe you mean it. I'm not going to pretend the last 2 years didn't happen, or that I'm ready to go back to how things used to be. But I hear you, Denise, and I'm glad you're doing better. Genuinely." We did not resolve everything in that cafeteria, over bad coffee, in the shadow of our father's hospital bed 3 floors up. Some things, I have come to believe, are not meant to be resolved in a single conversation. However honest, they're meant to be rebuilt slowly, if they're rebuilt at all, through years of demonstrated consistency rather than a single well-timed apology. But it was, I understood even then, sitting in that fluorescent-lit cafeteria, a real beginning. The first honest exchange my sister and I had had in longer than either of us could probably calculate, and it mattered more to me than I expected it to. What I did not yet know, that afternoon in the cafeteria, was that the following week, once my father was safely home and stable, once the immediate crisis had passed, my mother would sit me down and ask me for something far larger than anything Denise had ever asked for. Something that would test, in the most direct way possible, whether the boundaries I had built in Asheville were durable enough to survive contact with the oldest and most powerful pressure point in my entire life. Not my sister's need this time, but my parents' fear of growing old without me nearby. I stayed in Dayton for 10 days total, longer than I'd originally planned, because my father's recovery, while going well, required someone to be present for the first week of physical therapy visits and medication adjustments, and because I found, once I was actually there, that I did not particularly want to rush back to Asheville while he was still moving carefully around his own kitchen, wincing slightly whenever he reached too far for something on a high shelf. I stayed at my parents' house on Forest View Drive, in my old childhood bedroom, which my mother had converted into a sewing room years earlier, but which still, apparently, contained a pull-out couch, specifically for occasions like this one. It was strange, sleeping in that room again, surrounded by fabric bolts and a dress form draped in an unfinished garment, in the house where the whole architecture of my old life had been built and, eventually, dismantled. It was on the 8th night, after my father had gone to bed early and Denise had left to pick Tyler up from his father's. Marcus had apparently re-entered the picture in a limited co-parenting capacity over the past year, another small piece of news that had shifted in my absence. That my mother sat down across from me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea and a look on her face, I recognized instantly as the preamble to a significant conversation. "I want to talk to you about something," she said, "and I want you to actually hear me out before you say anything, because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I want to say it right." "Okay," I said, bracing myself, an old, familiar tightness gathering in my chest. "Your father's heart attack scared me more than I think I've let on to anyone," she said. "The doctors say he'll recover fully, and I believe them. But Claire, he's 68 years old and I'm 65, and this is the first time in our whole marriage that I've really understood, in my body and not just my head, that we are not going to be around forever, and that the time we have left is not infinite. I understand that, Mom. It scared me too." "I want you to come home," she said. And there it was, laid plainly on the table between us, the actual reason for the tea and the careful preamble. "Not for a visit. I mean move back. Your father and I are getting older, and Denise has her own life with Tyler now, and I need my other daughter close to me too. I need to know that if something happens again, you're 20 minutes away and not a 6-hour flight away. I've been so proud of you for building this life in Asheville, I have, truly. But I miss you every single day, and I don't understand why you have to be so far away to be your own person. Couldn't you build the same life here?" I want to describe, carefully, the specific quality of the pull I felt in that moment, because I think it is important to be honest about how strong it was. Stronger, in some ways, than any of Denise's requests had ever been, because it did not come wrapped in financial extraction or manipulation. It came wrapped in something much harder to resist. Genuine, aging parent fear, expressed with real love, asking for something that, on its face, seemed entirely reasonable. What daughter, hearing her mother say this after her father's heart attack, wouldn't feel the gravitational pull of guilt and duty pressing down on every cell in her body? But I had spent 2 years by that point learning the difference between love and obligation, between wanting to be present for the people I loved and believing my entire life had to be reorganized around geographic proximity to their fear. And so, instead of answering immediately, the way old Claire would have, the version of me who might have said yes on the spot, out of guilt, and spent the next 6 months quietly resenting a decision made under emotional duress, I took a breath, and I answered honestly, the way new Claire had learned to. "Mom, I hear how scared you are, and I understand it, truly. But I'm not moving back to Ohio." Her face fell in a way that hurt to watch. "Why not? What is so much better about North Carolina that it's worth being this far from your own parents?" "It's not that anything is better about North Carolina," I said. "It's that I built something there, for the first time in my life, entirely for myself. I have a business with employees who depend on me. I have friends who have become like family to me. I have a life I chose, brick by brick, after 46 years of organizing everything around what this family needed from me. I love you. I love Dad. I am not moving away from you. But I am also not moving my entire life back here because you're afraid, Mom, even though I understand the fear completely. So your business matters more than your father's health? I recognized this sentence the moment it left her mouth. Recognized its shape, its function, its lineage, because it was, structurally, identical to the sentence Denise had used at that Thanksgiving table 2 years earlier. Are you going to let your nephew be homeless because you're mad about a credit score? It was the same rhetorical move, deployed by a different person for a different stake, but built from the exact same architecture. An urgent, sympathetic need, framed as the only acceptable justification for my continued, unlimited sacrifice, with any boundary I set recast as a moral failing rather than a legitimate choice. That's not a fair question, Mom, and I think you know it, I said, gently but without backing down. I flew here the moment I heard he collapsed. I stayed 10 days. I will fly here every single time something like this happens, for as long as I'm capable of getting on a plane. That is not the same thing as living 20 minutes away permanently. I can love you both fiercely and still choose to build my own life somewhere else. Those two things are not actually in conflict, even though it feels that way to you right now. My mother was quiet for a long time, staring down into her tea. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its sharpness, settling into something more tired and more honest. I think I always assumed you'd be the one who stayed close, she said. Denise was always going to need looking after. I knew that from the time she was young, but you were always so capable, so put together. I think some part of me assumed that meant you didn't need anything of your own. I assumed your job was just to be near, in case we needed you, and I never really asked myself what that assumption was costing you. It was, I think, the single most self-aware thing my mother said to me in the entire course of this story. An acknowledgement, however incomplete, of exactly the dynamic I had spent 2 years trying to name and escape. That in a family with one child perceived as fragile and one perceived as capable, the capable one is quietly assigned an entire lifetime of unpaid labor, simply for the crime of appearing to be fine. I need you to understand something, I said, reaching across the table and covering her hand with mine. Being capable doesn't mean I don't need things too. It just means I've gotten very good at not asking for them. I'm trying to get better at asking now. And one of the things I need is to be allowed to build my life somewhere that isn't defined entirely by this family's proximity to crisis. My mother did not fully accept this that night. I don't think she was capable of fully accepting it in a single conversation, any more than Denise's apology in the hospital cafeteria had fully resolved 2 years of financial betrayal. But something in her posture shifted, some old certainty loosening, and when I left Dayton 4 days later, flying back to Asheville with a lighter heart than I'd expected to have, she hugged me at the airport curb longer than she usually did, and said quietly into my shoulder, "I'm proud of you, Claire. I don't say that enough. I'm proud of what you built, even the parts of it I don't fully understand." It was not everything I might have wanted to hear, in some ideal version of this reconciliation, but it was real, and it was hers to give freely rather than mine to extract through years of quiet sacrifice, and as I boarded my flight home that afternoon, I understood that it was, in its own imperfect way, enough. I bought the cabin near Lake Lure the following autumn, almost 3 years to the month after I'd first driven out of Ohio with everything I owned packed into a rented van. It was a small place, 2 bedrooms, a wide porch facing the water, a stone fireplace that the previous owners had built themselves decades earlier, and a dock that needed new boards along one entire side, which I spent most of that first October weekend replacing myself, badly, with YouTube tutorials playing from my phone propped against a toolbox, laughing at my own crooked handiwork more than I minded it. I want to talk about that cabin specifically, because I think it represents something important about what this whole story is actually about, underneath the family drama and the loan documents and the identity theft. It was not a large purchase in the scheme of things. A modest cabin, nothing extravagant, well within what my by then thriving practice could comfortably support. But it was, in a very real sense, the first purely joyful thing I had ever bought in my entire adult life. Not a strategic purchase, not an investment justified by future utility, not a resource held in reserve in case my family needed to borrow against it. Just a place I loved, bought because I loved it, existing entirely for my own pleasure and rest. I spent that first winter there most weekends, building a small library of books I'd actually chosen for myself, rather than whatever I'd had time to grab at an airport bookstore, learning to build a proper fire, watching the lake go from blue to gray to a strange, still white when the occasional snow came through the mountains. Priya visited often, and so did Marcus Webb, who had by then become not just my employee but something closer to family, a young man I found myself mentoring with a kind of investment I recognized, slowly, as the healthy version of the giving I'd once poured so destructively into Denise. Giving with boundaries, giving that expected growth and reciprocity rather than endless extraction. Giving that made both of us better rather than making one of us hollow. Whitfield Advisory Group had grown by that third year to 31 clients and 3 employees, and I had begun, cautiously, to think about what came next. Whether to keep growing, to bring on a partner, to eventually build something large enough to sell one day, or simply to keep it exactly the size it was, comfortable and profitable, and entirely under my own control. I had not decided, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not feel any urgency to decide. For the first time in my adult life, I had the luxury of choosing my next steps based on what I actually wanted rather than what circumstance demanded of me. It was around this time, too, that I began seeing someone, a man named Daniel Ferris, a structural engineer I'd met through the hiking group, divorced, no children, quiet in a way that initially struck me as reserved and eventually revealed itself as simply careful. A man who listened far more than he spoke, and who, on our 4th date, asked me a question no one in my family had thought to ask me in years. What do you actually want your life to look like in 10 years? Not what you're supposed to want, what you actually want. I told him about the cabin, about the practice, about wanting, eventually, more quiet than chaos, more building than rescuing. He listened and nodded and said, "That sounds like a good life to want," which was such a small sentence and meant so much to me, because it was the first time in longer than I could remember that someone had simply affirmed my own desires back to me without immediately attaching a request of their own to the affirmation. I do not want to overstate the role Daniel played in this story. This is not, at its heart, a romance, and I don't think the lesson of my life was, find a good man and everything resolves itself. The actual lesson, the one I'd already learned alone in an apartment above a bookstore 2 years earlier, was that I had to become someone capable of building a life for myself before I was capable of recognizing what a genuinely reciprocal relationship, romantic or otherwise, was even supposed to feel like. Daniel did not rescue me. I had already rescued myself, slowly, deliberately, over 3 years of careful choices. What Daniel offered was simply confirmation that the self I'd built was someone worth choosing, by someone who had nothing to gain from choosing me except my company. My family during this period remained at a careful, improving distance. I visited Dayton twice that year, once for my father's birthday, once for Christmas. The first Christmas I'd spent back in Ohio in 3 years. And both visits were, if not entirely without tension, at least free of the specific financial extraction that had defined every family gathering of the previous decade. Denise and I spoke more regularly now, careful, ordinary conversations about Tyler's school projects and her own slow, steady progress at the dental office, where she'd been promoted to office manager the previous spring. I noticed, with a caution that I allowed myself to soften only slowly, that she had never once, in the 18 months since our conversation in the hospital cafeteria, asked me for money. Not once. Not for Tyler's school trip, not for a car repair, not for anything, even when I suspected, from small details in our conversations, that money was occasionally tight for her. I did not know that Christmas, sitting at my parents' table on Forest View Drive with the same scorched tablecloth and the same china, that the following spring would bring one final test of everything I had built. Not a betrayal this time, but something more difficult in its own way. A genuine crisis, requiring a genuine choice, in which my family would finally, fully, without manipulation or leverage, simply ask for my help and trust me enough to accept whatever answer I gave. The call from Denise came on a Sunday evening in March, and I remember picking up my phone and seeing her name on the screen, feeling a small flicker of the old anxiety, a reflexive bracing I hadn't fully unlearned, even 3 years out, even after everything that had genuinely changed between us. "Hey," she said, and her voice had a quality I recognized as careful, deliberate, the voice of someone who had rehearsed how to begin a conversation she was nervous about. "I need to tell you something, and I want to be really clear up front that I'm not calling to ask you for anything. I just need to tell someone, and you're the person I wanted to tell." "Okay," I said, "I'm listening." "Tyler got diagnosed with scoliosis last week. It's moderate right now, not severe, but the orthopedist says if it progresses the way it's trending, he's going to need a brace, and if it gets worse than that, eventually surgery. The brace alone, if we need it, is going to run somewhere around $6,000 that insurance won't cover, and I've been sitting with the number for a week trying to figure out how I'm going to manage it, and I needed to tell you what's happening with him. That's it. That's the whole reason I'm calling." I sat with this for a moment, turning it over, noticing something important about my own internal reaction. I did not feel the old dread, the old anticipation of manipulation, the bracing for a leveraged plea about a child's suffering deployed as an argument for my unlimited sacrifice. What I felt instead was straightforward concern for a boy I loved and a genuine curiosity about what, if anything, my sister actually wanted from this call, given that she had explicitly, up front, told me she wasn't asking for money. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "How's he handling it? Is he scared?" We talked for almost 40 minutes about Tyler, about his appointment, about the doctor's cautious optimism that early intervention with a brace could prevent things from progressing to surgery, about how he'd been remarkably matter-of-fact about the whole thing, in the specific way 8-year-olds are sometimes better at processing hard news than adults expect them to be. Denise did not, at any point in that entire conversation, ask me for $1. She talked about her own plan, a payment arrangement she'd negotiated directly with the orthopedic practice, a second part-time weekend job she was considering picking up at a friend's boutique, a possible fundraiser her church group had offered to help organize. She talked like a person who had, somewhere in the past 3 years, developed the muscle of actually solving her own problems, calling me not because she needed rescuing, but because she wanted her sister to know what was happening in her son's life. It was 2 days later, sitting at my own kitchen table in Asheville, that I made a decision entirely different in character from every decision I'd made about Denise's finances in the years before I left Ohio. I called her back. "I've been thinking about what you told me," I said, "and I want to offer something, but I want to be really clear about the terms, because I think that clarity matters to both of us now." "Claire, I told you, I wasn't calling to ask." "I know you weren't. That's actually part of why I want to offer this. I'd like to cover the cost of Tyler's brace if he needs it. Not as a loan. As a gift, with no repayment plan, no promissory note, nothing you owe me. I want to do this because I love him and because I have the means to do it easily and because you asked for nothing, which tells me something has actually changed. But I need you to understand this is a one-time gift for this specific medical need, not a reopening of the account you and I used to have. If something else comes up next year, that's a separate conversation, and I reserve the right to say no to anything else, at any time, without it meaning I don't love you or Tyler." There was a long silence on the line, and when Denise finally spoke, her voice was thick. "Claire, you don't have to do that. I wasn't fishing. I promise you, I wasn't fishing. I know you weren't. That's exactly why I want to do it. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't feel like enough." "You don't need to say anything else," I told her. "Just take care of him. And Denise, I want you to know that I noticed. I noticed that you called to tell me, not to ask me. That matters more to me than you probably realize." I paid for Tyler's brace directly to the orthopedic practice's billing department the following week, $6,140, transferred without ceremony, without a document, without a repayment schedule, and I felt, doing it, something entirely different from what I'd felt writing every check to Denise in the years before I left. Not dread, not obligation, not the low, grinding resentment of a resource being drained against its will, but something closer to genuine joy, the specific satisfaction of giving freely, from abundance, to someone I loved, with no fear that the giving would never end, and no fear that my own foundation would crack beneath the weight of it. This, I think, is the piece of the story that matters most, more even than the leaving itself. The discovery that generosity and boundaries were never actually opposites. I had spent years believing that loving my family meant an absence of limits, that any no was a betrayal of the bond itself. What I learned, standing on the other side of that belief, was the opposite. That limits were the thing that made real generosity possible at all, because generosity offered under duress, extracted through guilt, given without any right of refusal, was never actually generosity in the first place. It was tribute. And tribute, however large the sum, never once, in 4 years of paying it, made either of us any safer, any closer, or any more whole. Tyler got his brace. His scoliosis, according to the last update Denise gave me, has stabilized and even improved slightly over the following year of treatment. I think of that $6,000 sometimes as the best money I have ever spent in my entire life, better than any of the $52,000 I gave before I left, not because the amount was smaller, but because it was, for the first time, entirely, uncomplicatedly, freely mine to give. My father turned 70 the following August, and my mother, in a departure from her usual restraint about such things, decided to throw him a real party. Not the quiet family dinner we'd always done for birthdays, but an actual gathering. 40-some people. A rented hall at the VFW post he'd belonged to for decades. A hired caterer. A slideshow of photographs spanning his whole life that Denise had spent weeks putting together. I flew in for it, of course, 3 days before the party, staying at my parents' house one more time in the old sewing room bedroom, and I noticed, walking through that house again, how different it felt to be there now compared to how it had felt during any of my previous visits since leaving. The tension that used to hum beneath every surface of that house, the unspoken calculations about who owed what to whom, the careful avoidance of certain subjects, had genuinely, measurably softened. Denise and I cooked together in the kitchen the night before the party, chopping vegetables side by side, talking easily about nothing important. And I found myself thinking, with a kind of quiet astonishment, that this was what an ordinary sisterly relationship might have felt like all along if the extraction had never started. If I had drawn a line at the very first car loan instead of 4 years and $52,000 later. The party itself was warm and unremarkable in the best possible way. My father, moved almost to tears by the slideshow, by the turnout, by a card signed by every single member of the beverage delivery route crew he'd worked alongside for 3 decades. I gave a short toast, my voice catching only once, about the man who had taught me, without ever quite saying it in words, that safety and love could exist in the same sentence, and I meant every word of it. It was near the end of the evening, most of the extended family and friends having already left, just my parents and Denise and Tyler and me sitting at one of the emptied-out tables with the last of the cake, that my mother said the thing I think she had been building toward, in various forms, for the entire 3 days of my visit. "I want to say something to all of us," she said, and I felt my father reach over and take her hand, as though he already knew what was coming and wanted to steady her through it. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, and tonight, with everyone together, I finally have the courage to say it properly." She looked at me directly, her eyes bright in the low light of the hall. "Claire, I am so proud of the life you've built. I want to say that first, clearly, without any conditions attached to it. What you did, leaving, starting over, building your own business, your own home, your own community, that took a kind of courage I don't think I understood, when you left, that you even had. I thought, for a long time, that you were running away from us. I understand now that you were running toward yourself, and that we were the reason you'd never had the chance to do that before." She paused, gathering herself, and continued. "But I want to ask you something, one more time, and I promise you this is the last time I'll ask it this directly. Your father is 70. I'll be 68 this winter. We don't know how many more years we have where we're both healthy and independent, and every single day you're 600 miles away feels like a day we're not getting back. I'm not asking you to give up your practice, or your home, or your life. I'm begging you, Claire. Truly, I don't use that word lightly. I'm asking whether there's a version of your life that could exist closer to us. Whether the business could move, or you could build a second office here. Or whether, even if not permanently, you'd consider spending more of each year in Ohio than you currently do. We miss you so much it aches, every single day, and I know now that missing you is not a reason for you to abandon everything you've built. But I had to ask, one more time, with everything I actually feel, instead of the guilt and the pressure I used to lean on instead." Denise beside her was nodding, her own eyes wet. "I'll say it too," she said quietly. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, after everything. But Tyler asks about you constantly. He wants his Aunt Claire Bear closer. And I want my sister back. The real relationship. Not just phone calls every few weeks. I know I broke something that might not ever be fully fixed, and I'm not asking you to fix it by moving. I'm just telling you what it would mean to us, honestly, without any strings this time." I sat with all of this for a long moment, looking at the 3 people I loved most in the world outside of Priya and Daniel, and the life I'd built 400 miles away, feeling the specific weight of being genuinely wanted rather than needed, which was, I realized, an entirely different sensation from anything this family had offered me in the decades before I left. This was not leverage. This was not a crisis dressed up as an emergency. This was simply love, expressed honestly, asking an honest question, with no guarantee attached to how I might answer it. "I hear you," I said, finally, taking my mother's other hand across the table, feeling my father's steady presence beside her, watching Tyler, now 9, lean his head sleepily against Denise's shoulder. "And I want you to know that what you just said means more to me than almost anything anyone has ever said to me in my life. I am not going to move back to Ohio. I built a life in Asheville that is mine, entirely mine, in a way nothing in my life had ever been before, and I am not willing to dismantle it, even for love, even for you." I watched my mother's face brace slightly, preparing for the disappointment, and I continued before she could retreat into it. "But I hear that what you actually need isn't a geographic solution. It's more of me, more consistently, more visibly present in your lives. So here's what I can offer, and I want to offer it freely, not because I'm being pressured into it. I'll come home 4 times a year instead of twice. I'll set up video calls with Tyler every single week, not just when something comes up. I'm going to look into whether it makes sense to open a small satellite office here in Dayton, not to move my life back, but so that a few weeks a year when I'm here for work, I could genuinely be here, present, not just visiting. And I want the two of you," I looked at my parents, "to consider seriously whether you'd ever want to spend a few months a year in Asheville yourselves, especially once Dad's fully recovered. I have a spare room at the cabin. Lake Lure is beautiful in the fall. I would love, more than almost anything, for you to see the life I've built, not just hear about it over the phone." My mother was crying by the end of this, but it was a different kind of crying than I'd seen from her before. Not the brittle, controlling grief of someone trying to extract a concession, but something looser, more grateful. The crying of a woman being offered a real relationship instead of the fantasy of an unchanged one. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "That sounds like more than I even let myself hope for." We sat together at that emptied table for a long time after that, the 4 of us and a sleepy 9-year-old, not solving anything else, not needing to, simply sitting in the warm, hard-won quiet of a family that had finally, after everything, found its way to something honest. I did, in fact, follow through on everything I'd offered that night at the VFW hall, though it took the better part of a year to fully realize. I found a small shared office space in downtown Dayton that spring, a co-working arrangement I used for about 10 days every quarter, enough to take a handful of legacy clients I still valued from my old life without ever intending to rebuild my practice there in any serious way. It gave me a reason to be back in Ohio regularly, a rhythm to my visits that felt structural rather than sacrificial, planned rather than reactive, chosen rather than summoned. The video calls with Tyler became a genuine fixture of my week. Every Sunday evening, 7 o'clock, a standing appointment neither of us ever seemed to want to miss, in which he showed me his latest Lego creation or told me, in the exhaustive detail only a 9, then 10-year-old boy can manage, about whatever historical period had currently captured his imagination. He went through a dinosaur phase, then a Titanic phase, then, memorably, an entire spring devoted almost exclusively to the engineering of medieval siege weapons. And I loved every single one of those calls with an intensity that surprised me, given how carefully I had once had to protect myself from loving this family too unconditionally. But it was my parents' first visit to Asheville the following October that I think of as the real turning point of this entire final chapter of the story. The moment when the family I had spent 4 decades holding up finally, for the first time, came to see the life I had built for myself, rather than simply hearing about it secondhand across 600 miles of distance and old resentment. They stayed at the cabin for 8 days, my father still moving a little carefully but stronger than I'd seen him in years, my mother wide-eyed and quiet in a way I wasn't used to from her, taking in the mountains, the lake, the small, unhurried rhythm of a life she had apparently never quite pictured when she'd imagined what my life in Asheville actually looked like. I took them to my office on Haywood Road, introduced them to Marcus and my other 2 employees, walked them through a small piece of client work so they could see, concretely, what it was I actually did all day. Not some kind of accounting thing, as my mother had described it to her friends for years, but a real practice, built from nothing, serving real business owners who trusted me with real decisions about their futures. I watched my father's face as he read a thank you note pinned to my office corkboard from Renata, my very first client, and I saw something shift in his expression, some final piece of understanding clicking into place about exactly what his daughter had actually accomplished in the years since she'd driven away from Ohio, with 2 suitcases and a plan nobody else had believed in as much as she had. My mother, one evening on the cabin porch, watching the last light go orange and then purple over the lake, said something I have carried with me ever since. "I think I always measured how well you were doing by how close you stayed," she said quietly. "I never once thought to measure it by whether you were actually happy. I'm sorry it took me so long to see the difference." "You're seeing it now," I said. "That's what matters." "I am," she said. "It's beautiful here, Claire. All of it. Not just the lake, the whole life. I can see now, in a way I couldn't over the phone, exactly what you built, and exactly why you needed to leave to build it." I introduced them to Priya, who came over for dinner one night and told my mother, with the easy, unguarded warmth that had made her one of my closest friends in the world, story after story about hikes we'd taken together, about the early, uncertain months of my practice, about the specific version of Claire Whitfield who had walked into that networking breakfast 3 years earlier, not knowing a single soul, trembling slightly as she introduced herself for the first time as something other than an employee. I watched my mother listen to these stories with an expression I can only describe as a kind of retroactive grief. Grief, I think, for all the years she hadn't been present for. All the small, hard-won victories of my rebuilding that she'd missed because she'd been too busy grieving my absence to ask what my presence, elsewhere, might actually look like. Daniel came to dinner too, one of the nights, and I watched my father talk with him for almost 2 hours about structural engineering and fly fishing. 2 subjects neither of them had any particular expertise in, but both clearly enjoyed discussing anyway, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't fully realized was still unsettled, a kind of permission, finally granted from the people whose approval I'd spent a lifetime organizing myself around, to simply be happy, on my own terms, in a life they hadn't chosen for me but had finally, genuinely, come to celebrate. They left after 8 days with promises to return the following spring, and my mother, hugging me at the small regional airport outside Asheville, held on longer than usual and said, "Thank you for building somewhere I could actually come and see." I don't think I understood until this trip that leaving and loving us were never actually the same thing as opposites. I'm sorry it took me 68 years to learn that. I stood in that small airport parking lot after their plane had taken off, watching it climb up over the mountains and bank east toward Ohio, and felt something I think had been missing from every single family gathering of my entire adult life until that visit. The sensation of being fully known, fully seen, by the people who had raised me, not known as the responsible one, not known as the family's foundation, but known, finally, as a whole and separate person who happened also to be their daughter, and who they had, at long last, learn to love without also needing to consume. It was almost 2 years after Tyler's brace, nearly 5 years total since I'd first driven away from Ohio, when Denise did something that I still think about more than almost anything else in this entire story, because it was the first time she ever gave me something back, without my having offered it, without my having asked, without any crisis at all forcing her hand. It arrived in the mail in late January, a plain envelope with her familiar handwriting on the front, and inside it was a check for $2,000 and a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long, that I have kept in a drawer in my office ever since, and that I want to describe here as faithfully as I can, because I think it captures something important about what real accountability actually looks like when it finally arrives. Dear Claire, it began. I've been putting off writing this letter for longer than I should have, mostly because I wasn't sure how to say what I wanted to say without it sounding like an excuse, or worse, like I was setting up another ask. I promise you this letter isn't either of those things. I got promoted to office manager 3 years ago, and since then I've been putting a little bit away every month, not much, but consistent, into a savings account I never told you about because I wanted it to be a surprise. Or maybe because some part of me was scared I'd fail at it the way I've failed at so many financial things before, and I didn't want you to watch me try and fall short again. I didn't fail this time. I've saved $11,000 over 3 years, which I know isn't the full 52 you gave me, and I'm not writing to tell you I've paid you back in full, because I haven't, and I may never fully be able to. But I wanted to start. This check is $2,000, the first of what I'm hoping will be regular payments, not because you're asking for them. You never once asked me to pay any of it back after everything that happened, but because I need to, for myself, to finally become the kind of person who follows through on what she owes, instead of the kind of person who lets her big sister absorb it silently. I think about the version of me who applied for that HELOC almost every single day. I don't think I'll ever stop being ashamed of her, but I've decided that being ashamed isn't enough, and it never was. For any of the years before that either. Shame doesn't pay anybody back. Action does. So here is my first payment, and here is my promise. I am going to keep doing this, every few months, for as long as it takes, until either the debt is paid or you tell me to stop, whichever comes first. Either way, I need you to know that I see, now, fully, what I took from you, and I am not asking you to forgive it. I am just asking you to let me try to earn something back. I love you, Claire. I loved you even when I was taking advantage of you, which I know doesn't make any sense, and which I've spent a long time trying to understand about myself. I think I convinced myself, for years, that your strength meant you didn't need protecting the way I did, and I used that belief to justify taking from someone I should have been standing beside instead. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep being sorry in the form of actual repayment, not just words, for as long as it takes. Your sister, Denise. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for a long time after I finished reading it, the check resting on top of the pages, and I felt something complicated move through me. Not quite forgiveness, not exactly closure, but something adjacent to both. A recognition that the sister who had written this letter was, demonstrably, meaningfully, a different person than the one who had submitted that HELOC application 5 years earlier. Not because she said so, because she had built, slowly and privately, the actual capacity to make good on a debt, and had chosen, unprompted, to begin doing it. I deposited the check. I did not send it back, though some old instinct in me briefly considered it, worried that accepting it might somehow reopen the financial entanglement I'd worked so hard to close. But I understood, sitting with it a little longer, that refusing the check would actually be its own kind of unkindness. It would deny Denise the dignity of her own repair, the chance to become, through consistent action, someone whose word could be trusted again. Some debts, I've come to believe, are not really about the money at all. They're about whether the person who took something learns to give something back, freely, as evidence of who they've become. Denise sent another check that June, another in October. By the following winter, she had sent 4 payments totaling $8,000, and I stopped, somewhere around the third one, thinking of the money itself as the point. The point, by then, was the consistency. 4 separate moments, spread across more than a year, where my sister chose, entirely on her own initiative, to keep a promise nobody was forcing her to keep. It was the single clearest evidence I ever received that the years of pain that preceded her apology had actually changed something real in her, rather than simply teaching her better language for asking for what she wanted. I never did tell her to stop sending the payments. As of this writing, she has repaid $19,000 of the $52,000 I once gave her, not the full amount, not close to it, and I have made peace with the strong likelihood that she never fully will. But I no longer measure the value of what happened between us by that final number. I measure it by the fact that every single payment, from that first envelope onward, arrived unasked, unprompted, uncoerced. The first truly voluntary gestures my sister had ever made toward me in our entire lives, and worth, in that specific way, more to me than the original $52,000 ever was. I've told this story now, from the first car loan to the last envelope in the mail, and I want to spend a little time, before I bring it to a close, talking directly about what I learned from all of it. Not as a tidy moral wrapped around a family drama, but as something closer to what I wish someone had told me, plainly and without judgment, back when I was 43 years old and saying yes to my sister for the very first time. The first thing I would tell her is this: being called responsible by your family is not always a compliment, and it is worth asking, early and often, what that label is actually doing for the people using it. In my family, responsible meant available. It meant reliable. It meant a person whose own needs could be reasonably deprioritized because she'd manage anyway, because she always had, because managing had become, somewhere along the way, mistaken for her entire personality rather than recognized as an exhausting, unsustainable habit. If you are the person in your family who gets called responsible, capable, the strong one, the one who has it together, I want you to sit with the possibility that this label may have been assigned to you not because it's true, exactly, but because it's convenient for everyone around you if you keep believing it. The second thing I would tell her is that guilt is not the same thing as love, even though they can feel identical in the moment, and even though families are very good at using one to disguise the other. Every single time Denise or my mother invoked Tyler's welfare to pressure me into another loan, another sacrifice, another silence, I felt something that registered in my body, exactly like love. An urgent, protective ache that told me I had to act, immediately, or something precious would be lost. It took me years to understand that this feeling, however real, was being deliberately triggered as a lever, not offered as an invitation. Real love does not require you to abandon your own future to prove it exists. Real love can withstand a no. The third thing, and I think this is the one that took me longest to learn, is that boundaries are not the opposite of generosity. They are the precondition for it. I spent 4 years believing that setting a limit with my sister would make me selfish, cold, a bad person, the kind of family member who lets a child lose his home over a credit score. What I discovered on the other side of finally setting that limit was the opposite, that the version of me who had no boundaries at all was not actually generous. She was drained. She gave not because she had abundance to share, but because she was terrified of what would happen if she stopped. And terror-driven giving, however large the sum, never once made either me or Denise any safer. It was only after I built a wall around my own resources that I discovered what genuine, joyful, freely offered generosity actually felt like. The $6,000 for Tyler's brace, given without dread, without a contract, without fear, because I finally had enough left over, in every sense, to actually want to give it. The fourth thing I would tell her is that leaving is not always about anger, and it doesn't have to be dramatic to be real. I did not slam a door. I did not scream at anyone across that Thanksgiving table, though I understand, completely, why some women in situations like mine do exactly that, and I don't judge them for it. My leaving was quiet, methodical, planned over 4 careful months with a career counselor and a spreadsheet, and a lot of very ordinary logistics. Selling a house, giving notice at a job, researching licensing requirements in a state I'd visited exactly once. Quiet does not mean weak. Quiet, in my experience, is often where the deepest strength actually lives, because it requires you to keep choosing yourself in 1,000 small, undramatic decisions, long after the initial adrenaline of a single confrontation has faded. The fifth thing, and perhaps the most important, is that people can change, but only if you stop absorbing the consequences of their choices long enough for them to actually feel those consequences themselves. Denise did not become a different person because I yelled at her, or because our mother finally understood the situation, or because a single Thanksgiving confrontation shocked her into growth. She became a different person because, for the first time in her adult life, I stopped catching her, and she had to learn, the hard way, in real time, without a safety net, what it actually took to build and keep a stable life. That was, without question, the hardest and most loving thing I ever did for her, and it did not feel like love while I was doing it. It felt like abandonment, like cruelty, like the worst version of myself. It was, in fact, the opposite. The first truly respectful thing I had ever offered her, because it was the first time I treated her as a fully capable adult, rather than a permanent dependent whose failures were somehow also mine to prevent. I think often about a phrase Priya said to me on that ridge overlook, years ago now. The people who benefited from the old version of you will always tell you the new version is selfish. I want to leave that phrase with you, whoever is listening to this, because I think it is the single most useful piece of wisdom I gathered across this entire 5-year journey. If you set a boundary with someone who has been benefiting from your lack of one, they will very likely tell you that you've changed, that you've become cold, that you used to be so much more giving. Listen to that accusation carefully, and then ask yourself a harder question underneath it. Giving to whom, and at what cost to yourself, and for how many years, before anyone thought to ask what you might need in return? I do not regret the years I spent supporting Denise. Not entirely. Not even now. I believe she was genuinely struggling, most of that time, and I believe my help, however imperfectly delivered and, however eventually abused, came from a real and honest place of love. What I regret is the years I spent believing that love had no right to also protect itself. That caring about my sister meant I had forfeited any claim to caring about my own future, my own credit, my own name being used without my consent. I do not believe any longer that those two things were ever actually in conflict. I believe, now, 5 years and one entirely rebuilt life later, that the truest form of love a person can offer their family is not unlimited sacrifice. It is honesty, held steadily, even when it costs something in the moment. Because honesty, in the long run, is the only thing that ever actually changes anyone, including the family members we love most, and including, perhaps most importantly of all, ourselves. I am writing the last of this from the porch of my cabin at Lake Lure, 5 years and 4 months since I drove out of Ohio in a rented cargo van with 2 suitcases and a plan nobody in my family believed in as much as I did. It is October again, the specific golden October of the mountains, when the ridge across the lake turns a color somewhere between rust and fire, and I want to tell you what my life actually looks like now, in concrete terms, because I think the specifics matter more than any tidy summary I could offer instead. Whitfield Advisory Group has 38 clients now and 5 employees, including Marcus Webb, who made partner last spring, a decision I made with more joy than I can properly describe, watching a young man I once mentored through his first terrified client meeting become someone capable of building alongside me rather than simply working for me. I still love the work, 6 years in a way I never once loved 11 years of filing compliance paperwork back in Dayton, because every single client relationship is one I chose, one I built from an actual conversation rather than an assignment handed down from a managing partner. Daniel and I got married 2 years ago, a small ceremony on this exact porch, 40 guests, my father walking me the short distance from the cabin door to the makeshift altar we'd built out of reclaimed barnwood. His hand steady on my arm in a way it hadn't been steady in years, 3 years past his surgery by then, and stronger than any of us had dared hope during those 4 days in the cardiac ICU waiting room. My mother cried through the entire ceremony, and afterward told me it was the first wedding she'd ever attended where she felt, watching the bride, that the bride herself had actually chosen every single thing about the life being celebrated, rather than simply accepting whatever life had happened to arrive. Tyler is 14 now, taller than Denise, deep in the specific, gangly awkwardness of early adolescence, and he visits the cabin every summer for 2 weeks, an arrangement Denise and I built together, carefully, deliberately, 3 summers ago, and that has become one of the great, uncomplicated joys of my year. He fishes off the dock I rebuilt so badly that first October. He argues with Daniel about historical military strategy with a passion that makes Daniel, an engineer with no particular interest in history, laugh so hard he has to leave the room sometimes. He calls me Aunt Claire now, mostly. The childhood nickname retired along with so much of his childhood, though he still signs his birthday cards to me Claire Bear as a private joke between the two of us. And I keep every single one of those cards in the same drawer where I keep Denise's letter from the envelope 5 years ago. Denise finished repaying $26,000 of the original $52 before I finally, gently, told her she could stop if she wanted to. Not because the debt was resolved, but because I had come to understand, watching 4 years of consistent, unprompted payments, that the debt itself had never really been about the number. It had been about whether she could become someone capable of honoring a commitment without being forced to, and she had answered that question thoroughly, long before we reached any particular dollar figure. She still sends a payment occasionally, unprompted, and I still deposit every check, because I understand now that refusing them would take something away from her that she needs more than I need the money, the ongoing, active proof, to herself, of who she has chosen to become. My parents split their time now, 5 or 6 months a year in Ohio, and increasingly longer stretches at a small guest cottage. They bought 2 properties down from my cabin, close enough for easy visits, far enough to preserve everyone's independence, an arrangement none of us could have imagined during those years when proximity and love seemed, in my mother's mind, to be the exact same thing. My father fishes with Tyler most mornings when they're both here in the summer. My mother has taken up watercolor painting, of all things, at 69 years old, inspired. She tells anyone who asks, by the specific quality of light on the lake at sunset, And there are 3 of her paintings hanging in my own living room now, imperfect and lovely. A version of my mother I never once encountered during the 4 decades I spent believing my primary function in her life was to be reliable. I think sometimes about the woman I was at 43, sitting at my kitchen table in Kettering, agreeing to co-sign a car loan because my sister had used my full name on the phone, and I had, without quite realizing it, already decided to say yes before she finished asking. I don't feel anger toward that woman anymore, the way I did for a while, in the rawest months right after I discovered the HELOC application. I feel something closer to tenderness, the specific tenderness you feel toward someone who was doing her absolute best with the tools she'd been given, tools that had taught her, across 4 decades, that love and self-erasure were the same instrument, that being needed and being valued were interchangeable, that the price of belonging to a family was an unlimited, unquestioned willingness to be consumed by it. I know now that none of that was true. I know that a person can love her family fiercely, can fly across the country the moment her father collapses, can send $6,000 for her nephew's medical brace without a second thought, can build a genuinely warm and honest relationship with the very sister who once tried to open $35,000 of credit in her name, and still, through all of that love, hold a clear, unashamed boundary around what she owes, what she's willing to give, and what belongs, finally and entirely, to no one but herself. If you are sitting somewhere tonight, listening to this story because some part of it sounded uncomfortably familiar, because you, too, are the responsible one, the reliable one, the sister or the daughter who has spent years quietly absorbing everyone else's emergencies while your own future waited patiently in the background for a turn that never quite arrived, I want to tell you the same thing my father told me at that kitchen table, the last time I sat there before I left. I hope you're safe. I hope, whatever you decide, you're moving towards something rather than only running from something. And I hope you come to understand, faster than it took me, that the quietest, strongest thing you will ever do in your entire life might not be the loud confrontation everyone imagines when they picture finally standing up for themselves. It might just be a woman packing 2 suitcases into a rented van at 5 in the morning, driving south and east as the sun comes up, toward a life she has decided, for the very first time, is entirely, unapologetically her own. There is one more conversation I want to tell you about, because I think it belongs at the very end of this story rather than anywhere earlier, even though it happened almost 2 years ago now, on a summer evening on this same porch, with Denise visiting for the first time on her own, without Tyler, without our parents. Just the 2 of us and a bottle of wine and the lake going dark in front of us. We had spent the afternoon the way sisters are supposed to spend afternoons, I think, in the version of family life I'd always secretly wanted growing up and never quite believed I'd get. Kayaking out to the little island in the middle of the lake, eating sandwiches on the rocks, laughing about nothing important. The easy, undemanding companionship of 2 people who genuinely enjoy each other's presence, rather than 2 people locked into old, exhausting roles. It was near midnight, both of us a little loose from the wine, when Denise asked me a question I don't think either of us had ever said out loud before in all the years of this story. "Do you think we'd be close now?" she asked, "if none of it had ever happened? If I'd never asked for the car loan? If I'd just figured my own life out the hard way from the beginning, without ever leaning on you at all?" I thought about the question seriously, watching the last light disappear off the water, because I wanted to give her a true answer rather than a comforting one. "I don't know," I said finally. "I think there's a version of us that never has this closeness actually, because we never have the crisis that forces either of us to finally be honest. I think, if none of it had happened, we might have just kept being the 2 sisters we always were. You, the one everyone worried about. Me, the one everyone assumed didn't need anything. Polite, distant, loving each other in that surface way families sometimes do, without either of us ever really knowing the other person underneath the role. That's sad, Denise said quietly. It is, I agreed. But I don't think it's wrong. I think some relationships only get real once they've survived something that could have destroyed them. I'm not glad the HELOC thing happened, Denise. I'm not glad about the 90 points on my credit score, or the $52,000, or the 4 years I spent slowly disappearing into being useful to everyone but myself. But I am glad now, sitting here with you, that we found our way to this. I don't think we'd have found it any other way, honestly. I think it took losing something real for both of us to finally understand what we actually wanted to build instead. Denise was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that I have thought about often since, something that felt, in that moment, like the truest and most complete resolution this entire story ever received. I used to think you leaving was the worst thing that ever happened to this family, she said. I think I actually believe now that it was the best thing. Not because I don't miss having you close. I do. Every single day. But because I don't think I would have ever become a person capable of sending you that first check if you hadn't first become a person capable of walking away. I want to end this story there, on that porch, in that particular truth, because I think it captures something more honest and more useful than any simple moral about boundaries or self-worth, however true those lessons are. The truth is more complicated than a lesson. The truth is that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the people you care about most is to stop absorbing the cost of their choices, even when it looks, from the outside, like abandonment. The truth is that walking away from a life that is quietly destroying you is not selfishness. It is the only way, sometimes, to become someone capable of coming back, not to the old role, not to the old arrangement, but to a real relationship built on actual honesty between two people who have both, finally, learned what it costs to be truly known. I still think, some mornings, about the woman standing in a Kroger parking lot with a half-abandoned cart of groceries, hearing for the first time that her credit was 90 days from ruin because of a car loan she'd co-signed out of love. I think about her with tenderness now, not pity. A woman who did not yet know that the quietest, bravest thing she would ever do in her entire life was still 4 years away, waiting for her on a highway heading south and east, toward mountains she had visited exactly once, toward a life she hadn't yet let herself imagine was allowed to be entirely her own. If any part of this story found you tonight because you recognized yourself in it, the responsible one, the reliable one, the daughter or the sister or the wife who has spent years quietly holding up more than her share, I hope you know that leaving, when leaving is what's needed, is not the end of love. Sometimes it is the very first real beginning of it. And I hope, whatever your own version of that highway looks like, you find the courage, someday soon, to drive it. Thank you for listening to my story. This story was based on real emotional experiences. Some details, names, and circumstances have been adapted for privacy and narrative clarity. I want to add one more piece to this story, out of order, because I think leaving it out would make the whole account feel tidier than it actually was, and I promised myself, starting this, that I would tell the truth even in the places where the truth is less flattering to the narrative of quiet, steady strength I've mostly told you. There was a night, about 5 months after I moved to Asheville, long before the practice had any real clients, long before Priya or the hiking group or any of the community I eventually built, when I sat alone in that small apartment above the bookstore and seriously considered calling my mother to tell her I'd made a mistake and was moving back. It was November, the first November away, cold and rainy in the particular gray way Asheville gets before the snow starts. And I had just lost what I'd believed was a promising potential client, a small landscaping business whose owner had taken one meeting with me and then, politely, chosen a more established local firm instead. A rejection that shouldn't have mattered much in the abstract, but that landed, that particular night, like confirmation of every fear I'd been quietly carrying since I'd packed those 2 suitcases. I sat on my secondhand couch with a glass of wine I didn't finish, and my phone in my hand, my mother's contact information already pulled up on the screen, and I let myself imagine, in vivid, tempting detail, exactly what it would feel like to simply undo the whole decision, to move back into a rental in Kettering, find a job at another accounting firm, resume the shape of a life that had, whatever its costs, at least been familiar, predictable, known. I did not make that call. I want to be honest about why, because I think the reason matters more than the fact that I resisted. I did not stay in Asheville that night because I was strong, exactly, or because I had some unshakable confidence in my eventual success. I stayed because I made myself do one very small, very concrete thing instead of picking up the phone. I opened my laptop and reread the financial model I'd built with Inez back in Dayton. The actual numbers, the actual runway I'd calculated for myself, the actual evidence that I had 11 more months of savings before I needed to be profitable, and that 11 months was, by any reasonable measure, still a great deal of time for one rejected pitch meeting to have any real bearing on. I looked at the spreadsheet the way I'd once looked at the spreadsheet documenting exactly what Denise had cost me, not as an emotional artifact, but as a simple, sobering set of facts. And the facts, that night, told me I was not actually in crisis. I was only afraid. I called Priya instead of my mother, even though we'd only known each other a few weeks at that point, because she was the one person in my new life who already understood, from her own divorce and her own relocation 8 years earlier, exactly what this specific flavor of doubt felt like. "It's the 5th-month wall," she told me over the phone, without missing a beat, as though she'd been expecting my call, or one just like it, from someone new to this particular kind of rebuilding. Everybody who starts over hits it right around now. The initial adrenaline of the decision wears off, and you haven't built enough of the new thing yet to feel steady in it, and your brain starts telling you the old life must have been better because at least it was familiar. It wasn't better. It was just known. Those aren't the same thing. "How did you get through it?" I asked her. "I made myself wait 30 days before making any big decision," she said. "Not because 30 days magically fixes anything, but because it gives you enough time to find out whether the feeling is actual information or just fear wearing information's clothes. Give it 30 days, Claire. If you still feel this way in 30 days, we'll talk seriously about what moving back might actually look like, but I don't think you will." I gave it 30 days. I picked up 2 more client meetings in that window, one of which turned into Renata, my very first real client, the woman with the ceramic studio whose pricing model I fixed in my 2nd month in business, the client whose gratitude and referrals became the actual foundation everything else was built on. By the time 30 days had passed, the despair of that November night had receded so completely that I sometimes have trouble now, fully remembering how close I came, that particular evening, to undoing the whole decision out of a single rejected pitch meeting and a rainy Tuesday. I tell you this part of the story not to undercut everything I've said about strength and boundaries and quiet courage, but because I think it's important, especially for anyone listening who is standing at the very beginning of their own version of this decision, to know that the doubt doesn't disappear the moment you make the brave choice. It waits for you on the other side of the choice, in the ordinary, unglamorous nights when nothing dramatic is happening at all, just a rejected client and a bottle of wine and a phone with your mother's number already pulled up. The strength isn't the absence of that night. The strength is Priya's 30 days. The strength is opening the spreadsheet instead of dialing the number. The strength is choosing, one very small, very unremarkable decision at a time, to keep building the thing you've already started, even when, especially when, no one around you yet has any proof that it's going to work. It worked. It took years, and it was built one client meeting, one hiking trail, one Sunday phone call with Tyler at a time, and none of it would have been possible if I had made that call to my mother on that rainy November night. I think about that night often, not with shame, but with a kind of gratitude toward the version of myself who was frightened and uncertain and still, somehow, chose to open the spreadsheet instead of picking up the phone. She didn't know, that night, everything that was coming: the cabin, the marriage, the 38 clients, the letter in the envelope, the whole family gathered around her father's 70th birthday cake. She just knew she had 11 more months of runway, and she decided that 11 months was enough time to find out what she was actually capable of building, if she just gave herself the chance to keep going. I hope, if you are standing at the beginning of your own decision tonight, whatever form it takes, whatever family pattern you are trying to finally interrupt, that you give yourself that same chance. 30 days. A spreadsheet instead of a phone call. One small, unremarkable decision to keep going, even on the night when going feels like the hardest thing in the entire world. That is, in the end, the whole quiet secret of everything I've told you. Not one dramatic confrontation, not one triumphant return. Just years of small, steady choices made in favor of a life that was finally, entirely, unmistakably, my own. Last month, my mother sent me a photograph she'd found while cleaning out a closet on Forest View Drive, a picture of me at maybe 7 years old, standing on the front steps of that house in a Halloween costume I'd forgotten entirely, a homemade witch's hat slightly too big, sliding down over one eye, my 4-year-old sister beside me dressed as a fairy princess in a store-bought costume that had, I'm sure, cost considerably more than whatever fabric scraps my mother had used to construct mine. I looked at that photograph for a long time before I texted my mother back. I did not feel the old bitterness I might once have felt, looking at such a literal snapshot of the pattern that would go on to define so much of my life, the older daughter making do, the younger daughter given the finer things, both of us smiling for the camera without either of us yet understanding what that arrangement would eventually cost. I felt instead something closer to gratitude, strange as that might sound. Gratitude for the 7-year-old in the too big witch hat, who had no idea yet what a long road lay ahead of her, who could not have imagined the porch in the mountains, the practice on Haywood Road, the letter in the drawer, the husband who asked what she actually wanted her life to look like. Gratitude for every hard year that taught her, eventually, that she was allowed to want things for herself, and that wanting them did not make her any less of a sister, a daughter, or a good person. I texted my mother back, "Frame it, send me a copy too. I love how happy we both look." She wrote back almost immediately, "You always did make the best of what you were given, even when it wasn't quite fair. I see that so clearly now. I love you, Claire." I set my phone down on the porch railing and watched the lake turn gold in the last of that afternoon's light, and I thought, not for the first time, that this exact, ordinary, hard-won peace was worth every single mile of the road it had taken to arrive at it. People sometimes ask me, when they hear pieces of this story, whether I regret any of it. The years of giving, the $52,000, the 90 points off my credit score, the identity theft that finally pushed me out the door. I've thought about that question enough times now to have a real answer, rather than the polite, deflecting one I used to give. I don't regret loving my sister enough to help her, over and over, even when helping her cost me more than I understood at the time. I regret that it took me so long to understand that love and self-preservation were never actually at odds, that I could have set the boundary at the very first missed car payment, or even before that, at the very first phone call, and still been every bit as loving a sister as I was during the 4 years I spent quietly disappearing into being useful. What I know now, sitting on this porch with a life I built entirely for myself, is that the people who love you the most will not always be the ones who ask you the least. Sometimes they are the ones who need to be taught, through your own steady, unapologetic example, exactly what respect actually looks like. Not because you demanded it in anger, but because you finally, quietly, walked away from anything less. I hope, if you take only one thing from everything I've shared tonight, it's this. You are allowed to build a life that is entirely your own, even inside a family that has never known you as anything but useful. It might take 4 years, or 5, or longer. It might take a rented van at 5 in the morning, or a much smaller, much quieter decision that no one around you ever even notices you've made. However it happens, whenever it happens, I promise you, it is worth every single mile of the road. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. I want to close with one small image, because I think it says more than any summary could. Last summer, on the dock, I rebuilt so badly that first crooked October. Tyler, 14 now. All elbows and sudden height. The little boy who once called me Claire Bear because he couldn't manage my full name, sat beside me with his feet in the cool lake water and asked, out of nowhere, the way teenagers sometimes ask the biggest questions as if they're nothing at all. Aunt Claire, were you scared when you left? Like actually scared? Or just sad? I thought about it honestly before I answered him, the way I'd promised myself all those years ago, that I would always try to answer him honestly, even about the hard things. Both, I told him. I was terrified almost every single day for the first year, but I was more scared of staying exactly where I was for another 20 years than I was of anything waiting for me on the other side of leaving. He nodded slowly, the way he does when he's turning something over seriously in that quick, curious mind of his, and then he said, I hope I remember that, when I'm older. That being scared isn't a reason not to do the thing. I hope you remember that too, I told him, and meant it more than almost anything I have ever said to him. We sat there a while longer, the lake going quiet and gold around us, and I thought, watching him skip a flat stone out across the water with far more skill than I'd ever managed at his age, that whatever else this whole long story had cost me, it had also given me this. A nephew who would grow up understanding, in a way I never once did at his age, that a person's worth was never actually measured by how much of herself she was willing to give away, but by how honestly and how bravely she chose to build a life worth keeping. And if there is one image I want you to carry with you, long after this story ends, let it be that one. Not the boardroom, not the bank letter, not even the porch at sunset, but a woman and her nephew, side by side on a dock she built with her own 2 hands, feet in the cool water, both of them finally, entirely, at peace. If you found your way to this story because some piece of it felt uncomfortably close to your own life, the sister who always calls when she needs something, the mother who measures your love by your proximity, the years spent quietly absorbing consequences that were never yours to carry, I want you to know that noticing the pattern is already the hardest part, and you have already done it simply by staying with this story until the end. You do not have to leave the state to reclaim your life. You do not have to buy a cabin by a lake or start a business from nothing to prove you deserve peace. Sometimes the whole of it is much smaller and much quieter than that. A single phone call where you finally say no and mean it. A single boundary held steady through the guilt that follows it. A single decision to stop being the family's foundation and start, finally, building something that is entirely, unmistakably, your own. Whatever your version of that first quiet decision looks like, I hope you find the courage to make it. And I hope, whenever you look back on it, you feel exactly what I feel now, sitting here on this porch with the lake going gold in front of me. Not triumph, not vengeance, just a deep, settled, well-earned peace. That peace was never going to be handed to me by anyone else. I had to build it myself, one honest decision at a time. So do you. Good night, and take care of yourselves the way you'd take care of anyone else you loved this much. See you in the next story.